Chapter 1. The Refusal. The great hall hummed with anticipation, a sound that reminded Daphne Greengrass of summer wasps trapped against window glass. She sat stiffly at the Slytherin table, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, and tried to ignore the weight of the Sorting Hat's decision, still settling around her shoulders like an ill-fitting cloak. Slytherin. Of course it was Slytherin. The Hat hadn't even paused before announcing her house, as if her bloodline alone had made the choice inevitable. As if she were nothing more than the sum of centuries of pure blood marriages and carefully cultivated prejudices. The thought sat uncomfortably in her chest, a knot of disappointment she couldn't quite name. "Granger, Hermione!" Professor McGonagall's voice cut through the whispered conversations as another first year approached the stool. Daphne watched the bushy-haired girl she'd noticed on the train, the one who'd been asking everyone about spells with the breathless enthusiasm of someone who still believed magic was wonderful rather than simply expected. The Hat deliberated for nearly a full minute before calling out, "Gryffindor!" to enthusiastic cheers from the red and gold table. Daphne found herself studying the girl's face as she hurried toward her new house, noting the mixture of relief and determination there. What would that feel like, she wondered, to be chosen for what you could become, rather than what you'd always been told you were? Longbottom, Neville. The boy who stumbled toward the stool looked terrified enough to be sick. Daphne had heard whispers about him on the train, how his parents had been tortured into madness by Death Eaters, how his grandmother expected him to live up to his father's memory. The Hat took its time with him, too, and when it finally announced Gryffindor, the boy nearly fell off the stool in his haste to join his new house. Names continued to be called, sorted, celebrated, and forgotten. The alphabet crept steadily toward P, and with each passing moment, Daphne found her attention sharpening. Everyone in the wizarding world knew there was only one Potter who mattered, only one Potter who would be sorted tonight. "Potter, Harry!" The silence that fell over the great hall was complete and immediate. Even the ghosts stopped their drifting to watch as a slight boy with untidy black hair and the most famous scar in magical Britain walked toward the stool. Daphne leaned forward slightly, studying his face. He looked younger than she'd expected, more fragile. There were whispers that he'd been raised by muggles, that he'd known nothing of the wizarding world until recently. Looking at him now, she could believe it. He moved like someone still uncertain of his place, still startled by the attention his very existence commanded. Harry Potter sat on the stool, and Professor McGonagall lowered the Sorting Hat onto his head. For a moment, nothing happened. The boy sat perfectly still, his green eyes wide and unfocused. Daphne could see his hands gripping the edges of the stool, knuckles white with tension. The seconds stretched on. She found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't say why. Then Harry's face changed. His eyes widened further, not with wonder, but with something that looked almost like panic. His mouth opened slightly, and his breathing became quick and shallow. Whatever the Hat was saying to him, and Daphne knew from experience that it said quite a lot, he didn't seem to be taking it well. "No," Harry said, his voice carrying clearly in the perfect silence of the great hall. "No, I don't. Stop." A ripple of confusion went through the assembled students and teachers. This wasn't how the sorting worked. You didn't argue with the Hat. You certainly didn't tell it to stop. Harry's hands moved to the brim of the hat, and before anyone could react, he pulled it off his head and stood up. The ancient artifact tumbled to the floor beside the stool, and the sound it made hitting the stone seemed impossibly loud. "I won't be sorted," Harry said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I don't want to be in any of your houses." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Professor Dumbledore rose from his chair at the high table, his blue eyes sharp with concern. "Harry, my boy, perhaps we should—" "No." Harry's voice was firmer now, more certain. "I'm sorry, but no. This isn't what I want. This whole place isn't what I want." He turned to face the high table, and Daphne could see his profile clearly, the determined set of his jaw, the fear and anger warring in his expression. "I'm leaving." The words hit the great hall like a physical blow. Professors McGonagall and Snape both started forward, but Harry was already moving, walking not toward any of the house tables, but toward the massive doors that led out of the hall. Daphne's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't know what she was thinking, wasn't thinking at all, really. But something about the sight of Harry Potter walking away from everything the wizarding world expected of him, choosing uncertainty over obligation, sparked something deep in her chest that she'd never felt before. Freedom. The word rose in her mind unbidden, and with it came a realization that nearly took her breath away. She didn't have to sit here. She didn't have to accept that the hat's word was final, that her bloodline determined her future, that she was doomed to become another Slytherin lady who smiled at the right parties and married the right pure-blood heir, and never once asked if there might be something else. She could choose. The thought was terrifying. It was also irresistible. Daphne stood. The movement felt enormous, though she'd done nothing more than rise from her seat. Conversations died around her as heads turned her way. At the high table, she could see professors staring in shock. At the Slytherin table, her new housemates looked at her as though she'd lost her mind. Perhaps she had. "Miss Greengrass," Professor McGonagall's voice was sharp with authority. "Sit down this instant." Daphne ignored her. She stepped away from the bench, away from the table, away from the life that had been planned for her before she'd even been born. Her legs felt unsteady, but her voice was clear when she spoke. "I'm going with him." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was simply the truth. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child who defeated the Dark Lord through means no one quite understood, had looked at Hogwarts, at the houses, at the entire structure of wizarding society, and found it wanting. And in his rejection, Daphne had seen a possibility she'd never imagined. She began walking toward the doors, following the path Harry had taken. Behind her, she could hear shocked murmurs erupting into full conversation, could hear Professor McGonagall calling her name with increasing urgency. She didn't look back. Harry had stopped just inside the doorway, clearly surprised to find her following him. Up close, she could see that he was shaking slightly, though whether from fear or adrenaline she couldn't tell. "You don't have to," he began, but she cut him off. "Yes, I do," she said simply. "Not for you. For me." Something flickered in his green eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or relief at not being alone in this madness. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin, and together they turned toward the doors. "Miss Greengrass! Mr. Potter! Return to your seats immediately!" Professor McGonagall had reached the doorway, her face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. Behind her, Daphne could see Professor Dumbledore approaching, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Professor," Harry said, and he sounded genuinely regretful. "But I can't stay here. This isn't right for me." "And where exactly do you plan to go?" McGonagall demanded. "You're 11 years old, both of you. You have nowhere else to—" "We'll figure it out," Daphne said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Surely that's what Hogwarts teaches, isn't it? To think for ourselves?" McGonagall's lips thinned to a nearly invisible line. "This is not thinking, Miss Greengrass. This is foolishness of the highest order. Your parents will be—" "My parents," Daphne said quietly, "chose Slytherin for me before I was even born. They chose my future, my friends, probably my husband too, if I let them. For once in my life, I'm going to choose for myself." She could see Harry watching her from the corner of her eye, and she wondered what he made of her words. Did he understand what it meant to be born into expectations so rigid they felt like a cage? Did he know what it was like to wake up every morning knowing exactly what your life would look like, down to the color of your wedding robes? "Please," Professor Dumbledore's voice was gentle as he approached them. "Both of you, step back inside. Let us discuss this like reasonable people. Surely whatever concerns you have can be addressed." "Can they?" Harry's voice was sharper now, edged with something that sounded like anger. "Can you address the fact that everyone here expects me to be something I'm not sure I am? Can you address the fact that I don't know anything about this world, but everyone acts like I should already have all the answers? Can you address the fact that I'm 11 years old and I just want to be left alone to figure out who I am without 1,000 people watching my every move?" The silence that followed his outburst was different from the one that had greeted his initial refusal. This one felt heavier, weighted with the recognition that perhaps this wasn't simply childish rebellion. Daphne looked at Harry, really looked at him, and saw herself reflected in his frustration. Different circumstances, different expectations, but the same desperate need to be seen as a person rather than a symbol. "We're leaving," she said, and her voice was steady as stone. "Together." And before anyone could stop them, they stepped through the doorway and into the corridor beyond, leaving behind the great hall, the sorting hat, and the futures that had been chosen for them by everyone except themselves. The massive doors swung shut behind them, with a sound like destiny closing one chapter and opening another. In the sudden quiet of the empty corridor, Daphne could hear her own heartbeat and Harry's quick breathing, and underneath it all, the faint sound of chaos erupting in the great hall they'd left behind. She should have been terrified. Instead, for the first time in her 11 years of life, she felt free. Chapter 2. The Escape. The castle corridors felt different when you were walking away from them forever. Harry had noticed that immediately. The way the torchlight seemed dimmer, the way their footsteps echoed differently on stones that no longer felt like sanctuary. Beside him, Daphne Greengrass moved with the careful precision of someone who'd been taught to walk like a lady, but her breathing was quick and shallow, betraying the composure her posture projected. They had made it halfway to the main entrance before the sound of heavy footsteps behind them announced they weren't alone. "Harry!" The voice was unmistakable, Hagrid's distinctive accent carrying a note of hurt confusion that made Harry's chest tighten with guilt. He turned to see the half-giant approaching, his beetle-black eyes wide with concern and something that looked like panic. "Harry, what are you doing?" Hagrid's voice was gentle, the way it had been when he'd first told Harry about magic, about his parents, about the world that was supposed to have been his birthright. "You can't just leave. This is Hogwarts. This is where you belong." The words hit harder than Harry had expected. Hagrid had been kind to him, the first person in his life to treat him like he mattered, like he was worth protecting. The thought of disappointing him felt like swallowing broken glass. "I'm sorry, Hagrid," Harry said, and his voice came out smaller than he'd intended. "I can't stay. I know you don't understand, but—" "Don't understand?" Hagrid's voice rose slightly. "Harry, this is the greatest school of witchcraft and wizardry in the world. You've been given a chance that most wizards would kill for. Your parents—" He stopped abruptly, his face flushing. "My parents what?" Harry's voice was sharper now. "My parents would have wanted this. Is that what you were going to say?" Hagrid's silence was answer enough. "You didn't know them well enough to say that," Harry continued, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "You told me that yourself. And you know what? Maybe they would have wanted me to come here. But they're not here to ask, are they? So I have to decide for myself. But you don't understand what you're giving up. He understands perfectly. The voice was crisp, authoritative, and entirely unexpected. Both Harry and Hagrid turned to stare at Daphne, who had stepped forward with her chin raised in a way that reminded Harry of the portraits he'd glimpsed in Hogwarts corridors, pure blood nobility rendered in oils and arrogance. "I beg your pardon?" Hagrid looked genuinely confused. "Harry understands exactly what he's giving up," Daphne repeated, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from 11 years of being told she was inherently superior to most of the wizarding population. "The question is whether anyone here understands what he'd be giving up if he stayed." Hagrid's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Harry found himself staring at Daphne with something approaching awe. He'd barely spoken to her, barely knew anything about her, except that she'd followed him out of the Great Hall. But here she was, defending choices she couldn't possibly understand. "Miss Greengrass." Professor McGonagall's voice cut through the corridor like a blade as she approached with quick, efficient steps. Behind her, Harry could see Professors Snape and Flitwick, their faces grim. "That is quite enough. Both of you will return to the Great Hall immediately." "No," Daphne said simply. McGonagall stopped short. "Excuse me?" "I said no, Professor." Daphne's voice remained perfectly level, perfectly polite, and perfectly immovable. "Neither of us is under obligation to return. We haven't signed any contracts, taken any vows, or made any commitments to this institution. We are children who have been asked to make a choice about our education, and we have made it." "You are children," Professor Snape interjected, his voice dripping with disdain, "who are clearly incapable of making rational decisions. Miss Greengrass, your family will be—" "My family," Daphne interrupted, and for the first time her composure cracked slightly, "has made it abundantly clear that my value to them lies in my ability to marry well and produce the next generation of pure-blood children. If that is the sum total of my expected contribution to the world, then I suspect they will survive my temporary absence." Harry felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of kinship with someone whose cage looked very different from his own, but was a cage nonetheless. The Dursleys had never expected anything of him except invisibility. Somehow, being expected to be everything might be just as suffocating as being expected to be nothing. "Where exactly?" Professor McGonagall asked, with the patience of someone speaking to very small children. "Do you intend to go? You have no money, no plan, no understanding of how the wizarding world works." "Actually," Daphne said, "I have all three." She reached into her robes and withdrew a small leather purse that clinked softly with the sound of coins. "Pure-blood families believe in providing their children with emergency funds. As for understanding how the wizarding world works, I was raised in it. And as for a plan," she glanced at Harry, "we'll figure that part out as we go." Before any of the professors could respond, the air in the corridor shimmered with golden light. Harry's breath caught as a phoenix materialized in front of them. Fawkes, Professor Dumbledore's familiar, his scarlet and gold plumage brilliant even in the torchlight. The phoenix looked directly at Harry, tilted his magnificent head, and sang a single clear note that seemed to resonate in Harry's bones. It wasn't a command or a plea. It sounded almost like approval. "Fawkes." Professor McGonagall's voice was bewildered. "What are you—" The phoenix spread his wings and flew directly to Harry, alighting on his shoulder with surprising gentleness. The weight was warm and comforting, and Harry felt some of the panic that had been building in his chest ease slightly. "Well, I'll be damned," Hagrid whispered. "Language, Hagrid," McGonagall said automatically, but her voice was distracted. She was staring at Fawkes as if the phoenix had just performed an impossible magic trick. "He's never—" Professor Flitwick's voice was barely audible. "In all my years here, I've never seen Fawkes choose anyone but the headmaster." Harry looked down the corridor toward the Great Hall, where he could see Professor Dumbledore approaching with measured steps. The old wizard's face was unreadable, but his blue eyes were fixed intently on the phoenix perched on Harry's shoulder. "It would appear," Dumbledore said quietly as he reached them, "that Fawkes has made his opinion on this matter quite clear." "Surely you're not suggesting," Snape's voice was tight with disbelief, "that we should allow two children to wander off into the night simply because your bird has taken a liking to Potter?" "I am suggesting," Dumbledore replied, his voice still maddeningly calm, "that phoenixes have an understanding of such matters that often surpasses our own." He looked directly at Harry. "Tell me, my boy, what did the Sorting Hat say to you?" Harry's jaw tightened. "That's between me and the hat." "Of course." Dumbledore inclined his head slightly. "Forgive an old man's curiosity. It is simply that the hat has never before been rejected in such a manner." "Maybe it should have been," Daphne said quietly. "Maybe more people should have asked whether being sorted into a house at 11 years old, based on traits they might not even fully possess yet, is really the best way to determine the course of their entire lives." The silence that followed her words was profound. Harry found himself looking at her with new respect. She'd put into words something he hadn't even been able to articulate to himself: the wrongness of being categorized, labeled, and filed away before he'd even had a chance to discover who he might become. Fawkes chose that moment to spread his wings and launch himself from Harry's shoulder, circling once around both children before flying back toward the Great Hall. The message was unmistakable. He'd made his choice, and now they were free to make theirs. "Albus!" McGonagall's voice held a warning. "Surely you cannot mean to allow—" "I mean," Dumbledore interrupted gently, "to trust that the wisdom of 11-year-olds and phoenixes alike should not be dismissed too quickly." He studied Harry's face for a long moment. "However, I would ask that you at least consider—" "No." Harry's voice was firm. "I'm sorry, Professor Dumbledore, but no. I've made my decision." The old wizard nodded slowly. "Then I wish you both the very best of luck. The grounds of Hogwarts will always be open to you, should you choose to return." With that, he turned and walked back toward the Great Hall, leaving the other professors staring after him in shock. "He can't be serious," Snape muttered. "He's always serious," Hagrid said heavily. "That's what makes him Dumbledore." Harry looked at Daphne, who was watching the retreating figure of the headmaster with something that might have been respect. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She nodded once, crisp and decisive. "Lead the way." They walked the rest of the distance to the castle's main entrance in silence, leaving behind the professors and their protests. The night air outside was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of the forbidden forest and the distant smoke from Hagrid's hut. Above them, stars wheeled in patterns Harry was only just beginning to learn the names of. "So," he said, as they began the walk down the long drive toward the school gates, "you mentioned a plan?" Daphne's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Hogsmeade Village has a Floo connection. From there we can reach London. And from London." She shrugged. "Well, the wizarding world is larger than just Hogwarts." "You know how to use the Floo network?" Harry asked, impressed despite himself. "I'm 11, not helpless," Daphne replied dryly. "Though I admit this will be the first time I've travelled without my parents' permission." They reached the gates of Hogwarts, massive wrought-iron barriers that stood open to welcome students and closed to keep dangers out. Harry paused for a moment, looking back at the castle that glowed with warm light against the dark sky. It was beautiful, undeniably so. For a moment, he almost wavered. Then he thought of the weight of expectations he'd felt settling on his shoulders in the Great Hall, of the way everyone had looked at him like he was a symbol rather than a person, and his resolve hardened. "No regrets?" Daphne asked quietly. "None," Harry said, and found that he meant it. "You?" She was quiet for a long moment, then shook her head. "My parents will disown me. I'm sorry." "Don't be," Her voice was steady. "I think I've been waiting my entire life for an excuse to disappoint them. You just gave me the perfect one." The walk to Hogsmeade was shorter than Harry had expected. The village was quiet at this hour, most of its residents already settled in for the night, but the 3 broomsticks still had light spilling from its windows and the sound of conversation drifting from within. Daphne led him past the pub to a smaller building, marked with a sign reading, "Hogsmeade Post and Flue Office." The witch behind the counter looked startled to see 2 Hogwarts students at this hour, but Daphne's imperious manner and the clink of coins seemed to settle any questions she might have had. "London," Daphne said simply. "The leaky cauldron." The green flames engulfed them one after the other, and Harry's last clear thought before the spinning began was that there was no turning back now. The leaky cauldron was busier than he'd expected for this time of night. The dim pub was full of witches and wizards nursing drinks and engaged in quiet conversation. But the moment Harry stepped out of the fireplace, soot-covered and slightly dizzy, the entire room fell silent. "Merlin's beard," someone whispered. "That's Harry Potter. What's he doing here? Shouldn't he be at Hogwarts? Why does he look like he's been travelling?" The questions multiplied as word spread through the pub with the speed of wildfire. Harry felt his chest tighten with familiar panic as dozens of pairs of eyes fixed on him with hungry curiosity. Beside him, Daphne stepped slightly closer, and her presence was oddly comforting. Tom, the toothless barkeeper, hurried over with an expression of concern and confusion. "Mr. Potter? Miss—" He looked questioningly at Daphne. "Greengrass," she supplied calmly. "Miss Greengrass, what brings you to London at this hour? Shouldn't you be—" "We need a room," Daphne interrupted smoothly. "2 rooms, actually, for the night." Tom's eyes darted between them, clearly struggling to understand the situation. "Does Professor Dumbledore know where you are?" "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said carefully, "knows that we've left Hogwarts." A gasp rippled through the pub. Harry heard someone mutter, "Left Hogwarts? But that's impossible." And another voice responding, "Nothing's impossible with that boy." Tom's face went through several rapid changes of expression. Confusion, concern, and finally a kind of resigned understanding that this was far above his pay grade. "Right," he said finally. 2 rooms. How long will you be staying?" "We're not sure yet," Daphne said, producing her purse again. The sound of gold coins seemed to settle Tom's remaining concerns. As Tom led them toward the stairs, Harry caught sight of movement near the fireplace. A witch in dark robes was throwing a pinch of powder into the flames, and he could just make out her words. "Daily Prophet Emergency Desk." His stomach dropped. Within minutes, everyone in magical Britain would know that Harry Potter had left Hogwarts on his first night. The thought made him feel sick, but there was nothing to be done about it now. Their rooms were small but clean, connected by a door that Tom assured them could be locked from either side. As the barkeeper bustled away, leaving them alone in the narrow corridor, Harry found himself looking at Daphne with something approaching bewilderment. "Why?" he asked simply. She understood the question immediately. "Why did I follow you?" He nodded. Daphne was quiet for a long moment, her grey eyes thoughtful. "Have you ever felt like you were suffocating in a room full of air?" Harry thought of the cupboard under the stairs, of the weight of expectations in the great hall, of the way everyone seemed to know exactly who he was supposed to be, except for him. "Yes, that's why." She turned toward her door, then paused. "Harry? Yeah? Tomorrow we're going to need a real plan. Tonight was the easy part." As her door closed behind her, Harry couldn't help but think she was probably right. They'd escaped Hogwarts, escaped the immediate pressure of the sorting and the expectations and the whispered speculation. But they hadn't escaped the larger problem of being 11 years old in a world that seemed determined to make decisions for them. He settled onto the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation from the pub below. Somewhere in London, people were already talking about what he'd done. Somewhere, reporters were writing headlines. Somewhere, his story was being told by people who'd never met him, but for the first time in his life, he'd made a choice that was entirely his own. Whatever came next, he'd chosen it. That had to count for something. Chapter 3. Consequences and Allies. Harry woke to the sound of urgent knocking on his door and the distant rumble of voices from the pub below. Pale morning light filtered through the grimy window of his room at the Leaky Cauldron, and for a disorienting moment he couldn't remember why he wasn't in his cupboard under the stairs. Then everything came rushing back, the Sorting Hat's invasive whispers in his mind, his panicked refusal, Daphne Greengrass following him into an uncertain future. The weight of what they'd done settled on his chest like a physical thing. "Harry?" Daphne's voice came through the connecting door, quiet but urgent. "Are you awake?" "Yeah." He sat up, running his hands through his already disheveled hair. "What's going on?" "Come look." He opened the door between their rooms to find Daphne standing at her window, still wearing the same robes from yesterday, but with her blonde hair plaited back in a severe braid that made her look older than 11. Her face was pale, and there was a tension around her eyes that hadn't been there the night before. "Look down at Diagon Alley," she said, without turning around. Harry joined her at the window, and immediately understood her concern. The normally bustling street was crowded with far more people than it should have been this early in the morning, and many of them wore the distinctive robes of ministry officials. Worse, he could see at least 3 people with the press badges and quick quotes quills that marked them as Daily Prophet reporters. "How long have they been out there?" he asked. "Since dawn, from what I can tell." Daphne's voice was carefully controlled. "Tom came up about an hour ago to warn us, but you were still asleep. The story made the morning edition." She handed him a copy of the Daily Prophet, and Harry felt his stomach drop as he read the enormous headline, "Boy Who Lived Rejects Hogwarts. Potter Walks Out on First Night." Below it was a smaller subheading, "Pure Blood Heiress Follows in Shocking Display." "They used your name," Harry said, reading quickly through the sensationalized article. The reporter had clearly interviewed several patrons of the Leaky Cauldron from the night before, and their account made it sound as though Harry and Daphne had stormed out of Hogwarts in some kind of dramatic tantrum. "Of course they did." Daphne's voice was bitter. "The Greengrass family name hasn't been associated with scandal in over 2 centuries. My parents must be absolutely mortified." Before Harry could respond, there was another knock on the door. Not the urgent rapping from earlier, but something more measured and official. "Mr. Potter? Miss Greengrass?" Tom's voice was apologetic. "I'm afraid there are some gentlemen here to see you. Ministry officials." Harry and Daphne exchanged glances. "We'll be right down," Daphne called back, her voice steady, despite the worry Harry could see in her grey eyes. They made their way downstairs to find the Leaky Cauldron's main room nearly empty of its usual customers, replaced instead by 4 stern-looking wizards in the burgundy robes of ministry officials. Harry recognized the lead wizard from his visit to Diagon Alley with Hagrid, Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic himself. "Ah, Mr. Potter," Fudge said, his voice carrying the kind of forced joviality that immediately put Harry on edge. "And Miss Greengrass, how good to see you both looking well after your adventure yesterday evening." "Minister," Daphne said, inclining her head in what Harry realized was probably the exact degree of courtesy required by pure blood etiquette. Nothing more, nothing less. "Now then," Fudge continued, "I'm sure you can understand that there's been quite a bit of concern about your sudden departure from Hogwarts. Parents are worried, the school board has questions, and frankly, the whole situation is causing rather a stir." "I imagine it is," Harry said carefully. Something about Fudge's manner reminded him uncomfortably of his Uncle Vernon when he was trying to be reasonable before delivering an ultimatum. "The thing is," one of the other ministry officials interjected, "legally speaking, you're both still minors, which means decisions about your education really ought to be made by your guardians, don't you think?" "Actually," a new voice said from behind them, crisp and precisely enunciated. "I believe you'll find the law is somewhat more complex than that." Harry turned to see a goblin approaching their table. Not just any goblin, but one whose elaborate robes and confident bearing marked him as someone of importance. The ministry official's expressions grew noticeably tenser. "Griphook," Daphne said quietly, and Harry caught the note of recognition in her voice. The goblin inclined his head to her. "Miss Greengrass. And Mr. Potter." His dark eyes fixed on Harry with an intensity that was somehow less unsettling than the eager curiosity he'd faced from wizards. "I am Griphook of Gringotts. I believe we have matters to discuss." "Now see here," Fudge began, but Griphook cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Minister Fudge, with respect, these children are currently under the protection of ancient laws governing sanctuary and choice. Laws that predate the Ministry of Magic by several centuries." "Sanctuary?" Harry asked, confused. "The Leaky Cauldron," Griphook explained, "sits at the threshold between the Muggle and magical worlds. By ancient treaty, it serves as neutral ground where all magical beings may seek refuge, regardless of species or political affiliation. More importantly, Goblin law recognizes the right of any magical person to refuse placement in an institution if they can demonstrate the capacity for independent thought and magical ability." The ministry officials were looking increasingly uncomfortable. "That's a very archaic interpretation of the law," one of them said. "Goblin law is older than wizard law," Griphook replied smoothly, "and goblins have long memories. We do not forget when our rights are respected, nor when they are threatened." Harry felt a surge of gratitude toward the goblin, though he wasn't entirely sure he understood what was happening. "Does that mean—" "It means," Griphook said, "that you have more options than these gentlemen might have you believe. If you would care to accompany me to Gringotts, I believe there are some matters regarding your family's accounts that might interest you." Before Fudge could protest, the door of the Leaky Cauldron burst open with enough force to make several patrons jump. Two figures strode through, a tall, distinguished wizard with steel-grey hair and cold blue eyes, and a woman whose beauty was as sharp as winter frost. Even without introductions, Harry could see where Daphne had gotten her bone structure and her unconscious arrogance. "Daphne," Lord Greengrass's voice could have frozen fire. "You will come home. Now." Daphne straightened, and Harry was struck by how much she suddenly looked like her father. The same rigid posture, the same controlled expression that gave away nothing. "Hello, Father. Mother." "Do not take that tone with me," Lady Greengrass said, her voice carrying the kind of barely controlled fury that Harry associated with Aunt Petunia at her worst. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The shame you've brought on our family?" "I have made a choice about my education," Daphne replied calmly. "I was under the impression that the Greengrass family valued intelligence and independent thinking." "Independent thinking?" Lord Greengrass's voice rose slightly. "This is not independent thinking, Daphne. This is childish rebellion, encouraged by—" He turned his cold stare on Harry. "By influences that no pure-blood witch should associate with." Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks, but before he could respond, Daphne stepped slightly forward. "Harry Potter," she said, her voice carrying the same aristocratic authority as her parents', "is the only person in the wizarding world who has offered me a genuine choice about my future. If that makes him a poor influence, then perhaps your definition of proper influence needs examination." The silence that followed her words was arctic. Harry could see something dangerous flickering in Lord Greengrass's eyes, the kind of look that suggested consequences far beyond a simple scolding. "Very well," Lord Greengrass said finally. "If you insist on this path, you will walk it alone. You are no longer welcome in Greengrass Manor. Your trust fund is frozen. Your name will be removed from the family tree." Harry expected Daphne to crumble, or at least to show some sign of distress. Instead, she simply nodded. I understand, she said. Thank you for making your position clear. Daphne, Lady Greengrass said, and for the first time her voice held something other than anger, something that might have been desperation. Please, think about what you're throwing away. I am thinking about it, Daphne replied quietly. That's exactly what I'm doing. Before her parents could respond, another voice cut through the tension. My, what a fascinating tableau. Harry turned to see Lucius Malfoy approaching with the kind of predatory elegance that reminded him of the snakes he'd sometimes spoken with at the zoo. The man's pale eyes swept over the scene with obvious interest, and his lips curved in what might have been amusement. Lucius, Lord Greengrass said stiffly. Cyrus, Narcissa sends her regards. Malfoy's attention shifted to Harry and Daphne. And these must be our young revolutionaries. How refreshing to see such initiative in the younger generation. Harry didn't trust the man's tone for a second. There was something calculating in the way Malfoy was looking at them, as though he was evaluating their potential usefulness. Mr. Malfoy, Daphne said politely, but Harry caught the wariness in her voice. Miss Greengrass, you've certainly caused quite a stir. Malfoy's smile sharpened. I wonder if you've considered all the implications of your choice. The wizarding world can be challenging for those without proper connections. Are you offering to help? Harry asked, though every instinct he possessed was screaming warnings. I'm offering perspective, Malfoy replied smoothly. There are those who believe the current educational system could benefit from reform. Your actions yesterday may have opened doors that have long been closed. Harry didn't understand half of what Malfoy was saying, but he understood enough to know that the man was trying to use them somehow. The realization made his skin crawl. Before anyone could respond, there was a loud pop, and suddenly a house elf stood in the middle of the room. Harry recognized him immediately. The enormous eyes, the tennis ball green skin, the tea towel draped around his thin body like a toga. Dobby, he said, startled. Harry Potter! The elf's voice was filled with something that sounded like reverence. Dobby has heard what Harry Potter has done. Harry Potter is a great wizard who chooses freedom. Dobby! Lucius Malfoy's voice cracked like a whip. What are you doing here? The house elf cowered but didn't disappear. Dobby is bringing Harry Potter a message, he squeaked. From those who wish Harry Potter well. What message? Harry asked, ignoring Malfoy's furious expression. That Harry Potter has friends, Dobby said, his voice growing stronger. Friends who understand what it means to choose freedom over safety. Dobby must take Harry Potter away from bad wizards who try to use Harry Potter for their own purposes. You will return to the manor immediately, Malfoy snarled, but Dobby was already moving. With surprising strength for such a small creature, the house elf grabbed both Harry and Daphne by the hands. Hold tight, he squeaked, and the world dissolved into chaos. The next thing Harry knew, they were standing in a narrow alley that smelled of cabbage and something distinctly unpleasant. Dobby had released their hands and was already beginning to fade around the edges. Where are we? Daphne asked, looking around at the grimy brick walls and overflowing dustbins. Safe, said a gravelly voice from the shadows. For now, anyway. A man emerged from behind one of the dustbins, short, grizzled, and wearing robes that had seen much better days. His face was weathered and clever, and his eyes held the kind of wariness that came from a lifetime of staying one step ahead of trouble. Mundungus Fletcher, he said, extending a hand that was missing 2 fingers. Call me Dung. And you, he looked directly at Harry, are James Potter's boy. Harry felt something tighten in his chest. You knew my father? Knew him? I owed him my life, more than once. Dung's expression softened slightly. He and your mother. They were good people. The kind who'd help someone in trouble without asking what was in it for them. He looked between Harry and Daphne. Heard through the grapevine that you might be in need of that kind of help yourselves. The grapevine? Daphne asked suspiciously. Word travels fast in certain circles when Harry Potter does something unexpected. Dung grinned, showing several missing teeth. And from what I hear, walking out of Hogwarts on your first night counts as unexpected. Before Harry could ask what he meant, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps and voices from the mouth of the alley. Dung's expression immediately grew serious. "Right then," he said quietly. "Looks like you've got visitors. Question is, do you want to face them, or would you rather I showed you another way out?" Harry looked at Daphne, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her grey eyes. They'd been free of Hogwarts for less than a day, and already it felt like the entire wizarding world was converging on them. "Another way out," Daphne said firmly, and Harry found himself nodding in agreement. "Smart choice," Dung said. "This way, and mind the—" He was interrupted by a sharp knock echoing from somewhere nearby. Not the sound of knuckles on wood, but something metallic and urgent. The kind of knock that suggested whoever was doing it wasn't planning to wait very long for an answer. Dung's face went pale. "Well," he said quietly, "that's not good at all." Chapter 4. The underground path, the metallic knock came again, more insistent this time, and Harry found himself moving closer to Daphne without conscious thought. Mundungus Fletcher held up a hand for silence, his weathered face creased with concentration as he listened to something Harry couldn't hear. "That's not ministry," Dung said quietly after a moment. "Too polite. And it's not Death Eaters either. They don't knock." His expression relaxed slightly. "Actually, I think I know who that is." He led them through a maze of narrow passages between buildings that Harry hadn't even noticed existed, finally stopping at a door so unremarkable it might have been invisible. The knocking was coming from the other side, patient but persistent. "Remus," Dung called softly. "It's me, Dung." The voice that answered was tired but warm, with an edge of concern that reminded Harry oddly of Professor McGonagall. "I've brought some friends who'd like to meet our young refugees." Dung opened the door to reveal a tall, thin man with light brown hair and clothes that had been mended more than once. His face was prematurely lined, and there were shadows under his amber eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, but his smile was genuine as it settled on Harry. "Mr. Potter," he said, extending his hand. "Remus Lupin. I was a friend of your parents." The simple words hit Harry with unexpected force. In the past 2 days, he'd met Hagrid, who'd rescued his father at school, and Mundungus, who'd owed James Potter his life. But this man spoke of friendship in the present tense, as though it were something that death couldn't entirely sever. "Professor Lupin?" Daphne asked, and Harry heard surprise in her voice. "I thought you taught defense against the dark arts." "I did, briefly, some years ago, and I may again someday." Lupin's smile turned slightly rueful. "But at the moment, I find myself between positions. As do you, I understand." Harry felt heat creep up his neck. "We didn't mean to cause so much trouble." "Trouble?" Lupin looked genuinely confused. "My dear boy, you've done something remarkable. You've reminded the wizarding world that choice matters more than expectation. That's not trouble, that's courage." "But surely leaving Hogwarts—" Daphne began. "Hogwarts is a fine institution," Lupin interrupted gently. "But it is not the only path to magical education. There are alternative arrangements, communities of magical beings who have learned to teach and learn outside the traditional system." "What kind of communities?" Harry asked, though something in his chest was already leaping with hope at the possibility that they weren't completely adrift. "The kind," said a new voice from behind Lupin, "that welcome those who think for themselves." Harry's eyes widened as a centaur stepped into view. The being was magnificent, easily 7 feet tall when you counted his human torso, with a chestnut coat that gleamed in the dim light of the alley. His face was aristocratic and ageless, with silver hair that flowed to his shoulders and eyes like starlight. "This is Firenze," Lupin said. "He teaches divination and nature magic to those willing to learn the old ways." Daphne's intake of breath was sharp and audible. Harry glanced at her and saw that her face had gone pale, her grey eyes wide with what looked like shock. "Miss Greengrass?" Firenze's voice was like distant thunder. "You seem distressed." "I—" Daphne swallowed hard. "Forgive me. I was taught that centaurs were— that is, my family believes— that we are inferior beings, suitable only for classification and control." Firenze's tone held no anger, only sad understanding. "Yes, I am aware of what pure-blood families teach their children about my kind." The silence that followed was painful. Harry could see the struggle playing out across Daphne's face, everything she'd been taught warring with the evidence of her own eyes. This wasn't some savage beast or clever animal. This was clearly a being of intelligence and dignity. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I was taught wrongly about many things." Firenze inclined his head gravely. "The capacity to question one's teachings is the beginning of wisdom. Perhaps there is hope for your generation yet." "There's more than hope," said another voice, and Harry turned to see a goblin approaching, not Griphook, but another of similar bearing and authority. "There's opportunity. I am Ragnok of the Goblin Legal Department. Griphook sent word of your situation." Harry found himself looking between the centaur and the goblin with something approaching amazement. Yesterday, his biggest concern had been whether the Dursleys would remember to feed him. Now he was apparently being recruited by magical beings he'd never even known existed. "What kind of opportunity?" Daphne asked, and Harry could hear the careful control in her voice. "The opportunity to learn magic as it was meant to be learned," Ragnok replied. "Not filtered through the prejudices and limitations of wizarding institutions, but directly from those who have practiced it longest. Goblin magic is older than Hogwarts. Centaur wisdom predates human civilization. We have much to teach those with the courage to learn." "But surely there are laws," Daphne began. "Made by wizards for wizards," Ragnok said with a sharp smile. "Goblin law recognizes the right of magical beings to educate willing students, regardless of species. And centaur law acknowledges no authority but that of the forest and the stars." Harry felt a thrill of possibility mixed with deep uncertainty. What would that even look like? Learning from all of you. "Like what education should have been all along," Lupin said gently. "Collaborative, comprehensive, respectful of different perspectives and ways of knowing." Before Harry could respond, Mundungus cleared his throat. "Not to interrupt this philosophical discussion, but we're still standing in an alley having this conversation. Might want to take it somewhere a bit more private." "Agreed," said a crisp voice from the mouth of the alley. "Though I believe our current location is more secure than you might think." An elderly woman approached them with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing chaos. She was small and slightly hunched, with iron-grey hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She looked utterly ordinary, the sort of person you might pass on the street without a second glance. "Mrs. Figg," Harry said, recognizing her immediately. "What are you doing here?" Arabella Figg smiled, and suddenly her ordinary face seemed transformed. "Hello, Harry dear. I've been waiting rather a long time to have a proper conversation with you." "You have?" Harry felt as though the world was shifting around him yet again. "Oh, yes. You see, I'm what we call a squib. Born to magical parents, but without the ability to perform magic myself. I've been watching over you since you were left with the Dursleys." Her expression hardened slightly. "Not closely enough, I'm afraid. If I had known the extent of their negligence, I would have intervened sooner." Daphne was staring at Mrs. Figg with obvious fascination. "You're part of this network too?" "My dear, I helped create it." Mrs. Figg's smile returned. "When you've spent your life caught between two worlds, magical enough to see magic, but not magical enough to be accepted by wizarding society, you learn the value of alternative communities." She gestured toward a nondescript door that Harry was certain hadn't been there moments before. "Shall we continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable? I believe you'll find my home better suited to honest discussion." The space behind the door was impossible. Harry was sure of it. The alley they'd been standing in was barely wide enough for 3 people, wedged between 2 narrow buildings. But Mrs. Figg's home was spacious and warm, with a sitting room that could have accommodated 20 people comfortably. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes in languages Harry didn't recognize, and the air smelled of old parchment and something that reminded him of Hagrid's tea. "How?" Daphne began. "Undetectable extension charm," Mrs. Figg said matter-of-factly. "Quite advanced magic, but when you have friends who specialize in spatial manipulation, these things become possible." She gestured toward the goblin. "Goblin magic is particularly suited to working with space and substance in ways that wizard magic struggles to replicate." Harry found himself settling into an armchair that was almost certainly enchanted to be the most comfortable piece of furniture he'd ever encountered. Daphne took the chair across from him, and he could see her looking around the room with an expression of wonder mixed with something that might have been relief. "Right then," Mrs. Figg said, as she busied herself with tea preparations. "Let's discuss what happens next." "What do you mean?" Harry asked. "I mean," said Lupin, settling onto a sofa that somehow accommodated both his human frame and Firenze's horse body, "that you've opened a door that many of us have been hoping someone would open for a very long time. The question is whether you're prepared to walk through it. The traditional magical education system," Ragnarok added, "has become increasingly rigid and exclusionary. It teaches young wizards that their way of understanding magic is the only valid way, that other magical beings are inferior or dangerous, that power should be hoarded rather than shared. But it doesn't have to be that way," Firenze said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Magic is vast enough to encompass many approaches, many perspectives. A human child taught only by humans learns only a fraction of what magic can be." Harry felt something stirring in his chest, excitement mixed with apprehension. "You're talking about teaching us yourselves, all of you?" "Not just us," Mrs. Figg said, setting down a tea service that included cups sized appropriately for beings of very different statures. "There are others. Werewolves who understand transformation magic in ways no textbook can convey. Vila who know glamour and persuasion as naturally as breathing. Even some vampires who have mastered forms of protective magic that most wizards believe to be impossible." Daphne's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "Werewolves? Vampires? But they're dangerous." Lupin's voice was very quiet. "Yes, Miss Greengrass, some of us are. But danger and evil are not the same thing. A kitchen knife is dangerous. A racing broom is dangerous. That doesn't make them inherently wrong." There was something in his tone that made Harry look at him more carefully. The man's amber eyes held depths of pain that seemed far too old for his face, and suddenly Harry understood. "You're a werewolf," he said. "It wasn't a question." Lupin nodded slowly. "I am. And before you ask, no, I am not dangerous to children. Not when I'm properly medicated, not when I plan carefully, not when I'm surrounded by friends who help me maintain control." Harry found, to his own surprise, that he wasn't frightened. If anything, he felt a strange kinship with someone else who carried something inside them that made other people afraid. "The point," Mrs. Figg said gently, "is that you have a choice. You can return to Hogwarts, accept their apologies and their sorting, and receive a perfectly adequate magical education. Or you can stay with us, learn from teachers who have never been invited into the halls of traditional institutions, and discover what magic looks like when it's not constrained by fear and prejudice." "But is it legal?" Daphne asked. "I mean, truly legal, not just creative interpretation?" Ragnarok's smile was sharp. "Miss Greengrass, I am a master of goblin law, which predates wizard law by millennia. Firenze is a representative of the Centaur nation, which has never acknowledged human legal authority. Mrs. Fig operates under squib rights, which are guaranteed by the International Confederation of Wizards. And Professor Lupin, he glanced at the werewolf. Well, Professor Lupin has more legal qualifications than most of the Hogwarts staff, regardless of his lycanthropy. The question isn't whether it's legal, Firenze added. The question is whether you're brave enough to learn from teachers who don't look like you. Harry looked at Daphne and saw his own uncertainty reflected in her grey eyes. But he also saw something else, a spark of curiosity, of possibility, that reminded him of how he'd felt when Hagrid first told him he was a wizard. "What would we learn?" Harry asked. "Everything," Lupin said simply. "History from beings who lived through it. Defense magic from those who have faced real danger. Potions from those who understand ingredients in their natural state. Divination from those who can truly see the future. And perhaps most importantly," Mrs. Fig added, "you would learn that magic is not the exclusive domain of witches and wizards. That community can exist across species lines. That difference is not something to be feared or conquered, but something to be celebrated and learned from." As if summoned by her words, there was a soft knock on the door. Mrs. Fig opened it to reveal a tall, slightly haggard-looking man with kind eyes and greying hair. He nodded politely to the assembled group before his gaze settled on Harry and Daphne. "This would be Marcus Belby," Mrs. Fig said, by way of introduction. "He's offered to help with your defensive magic training." "Defensive magic?" Daphne asked. "Miss Greengrass," Marcus said, his voice warm despite the weariness in his face, "if you're going to live outside the traditional protections of Wizarding Society, you'll need to know how to protect yourselves, not just from dark wizards, but from those who might see you as convenient tools or dangerous symbols." He was right, Harry realized. Already they'd been approached by ministry officials and pure-blood politicians seeking to use them. There would be others. "Marcus is a werewolf as well," Lupin explained. "But his specialty is protective magic, wards, shields, escape routes, things they don't teach first years at Hogwarts. Things they don't teach seventh years either," Marcus added with a slight smile. "Academic defensive magic tends to focus on dueling. Real defensive magic is about staying alive." Harry found himself nodding. "When would we start?" "Now, if you're willing," Firenze said. "Magic is best learned through experience, not theory. And you have already demonstrated that you possess the most important quality of any student." "What's that?" Daphne asked. "The willingness to choose your own path." The centaur moved to the center of the room, and suddenly Harry could smell pine needles and night air, could hear the distant call of owls and the whisper of wind through leaves. Firenze's eyes reflected starlight that couldn't possibly exist indoors. "Lesson 1, Firenze said, his voice resonating with ancient authority. "The history of magic is not the history wizards tell. It is older, deeper, and far more complex than any human institution acknowledges. Listen, and I will tell you how magic truly began." As Firenze's voice washed over them, carrying stories of magic's origins that bore no resemblance to anything in Hogwarts textbooks, Harry felt something settle in his chest. For the first time since leaving Privet Drive, he felt like he might be exactly where he belonged. Chapter 5. Growing Knowledge. By the time December snow began falling over London, Harry Potter had learned 3 important things about magical education. First, that centaurs never taught the same lesson twice. Second, that goblin mathematics made his head hurt in entirely new ways. And third, that Daphne Greengrass had a laugh like silver bells when she thought something was genuinely funny. The third discovery had come as the biggest surprise. 3 months had passed since they'd walked out of Hogwarts, and Mrs. Fig's impossible house had become more familiar to Harry than Privet Drive had ever been. The sitting room where they spent most of their days had been reconfigured to accommodate their growing collection of books, practice dummies, and what Ragnok called educational necessities, which seemed to include everything from ancient goblin scrolls to what appeared to be a miniature forest that Firenze had somehow convinced to grow in a corner near the windows. "You're overthinking it again," Daphne said, not looking up from the runic equation she was working on. They'd pushed 2 desks together by the tall windows, and the winter light caught the gold in her hair as she bent over her parchment. Defensive magic isn't about perfect form, it's about staying alive. Harry paused in his attempt to maintain 3 different shield charms simultaneously and glanced over at her work. The ancient runes seemed to shimmer slightly as she wrote them, responding to her magic in a way that still made him slightly envious. She'd taken to magical lore and runic studies like a fish to water, her pure blood education having given her a foundation that their unconventional teachers could build upon. "Easy for you to say," Harry replied, letting his shields drop with a frustrated sigh. "You've been reading lore texts for fun. I'm still trying to figure out why goblins count in base 13. "Because," Ragnarok's gravelly voice came from across the room, where he was grading their latest assignment. "Base 10 is a human invention based on the number of fingers you possess. Goblins have different priorities." Daphne looked up from her runes and gave Harry that silver bell laugh. "You should see your face when he explains goblin mathematics. You look like someone speaking in tongues." "Sometimes I think they are," Harry muttered. But he was smiling. 3 months ago, he'd barely known Daphne Greengrass existed. Now she was his closest friend, his study partner, and quite possibly the only person in the world who understood what it felt like to walk away from everything you were supposed to want. Over the weeks, they'd settled into an easy partnership. Harry excelled at anything involving magical creatures. He could communicate with Mrs. Fig's half-Kneasel cats, understand the emotional states of Firenze's forest friends, and had even managed a brief conversation with a particularly grumpy garden gnome. Daphne, meanwhile, had thrown herself into magical lore and ancient magic with the intensity of someone who'd spent 11 years being told she was meant for nothing more than pure blood breeding. "Try it again," Marcus Belby's voice came from behind Harry, patient as always. The werewolf had become Harry's primary instructor in defensive magic, and his teaching style was refreshingly practical. "But this time, don't think about the textbook forms. Think about what you're protecting." Harry raised his wand again, but before he could cast, the air shimmered, and Firenze materialized in the center of the room. The centaur's ability to appear and disappear without warning had stopped startling them weeks ago, though Harry still wasn't entirely sure how he managed it in an indoor space. "Young Harry," Firenze said, without preamble, his starlight eyes serious, "we must speak." Harry felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Over the months, Firenze had shared fragments of prophecies and star readings that painted a picture of Harry's future far more complex than anything Hagrid had told him. Most of it was cryptic centaur wisdom that Harry struggled to understand, but some of it had been disturbingly clear. "Is it about the dreams again?" Harry asked. Daphne's head snapped up, her grey eyes sharp with concern. She'd become protective of him in a way that reminded Harry of the fierce loyalty Mrs. Weasley had shown her children during their brief meeting at King's Cross. It was strange to have someone worry about him. Stranger still to find that he worried about her in return. "Partially," Firenze admitted. "But more immediately, it is about concealment. The stars suggest that your hidden time grows short." "What do you mean?" Daphne asked, setting down her quill. "The centaur means," Professor Lupin said as he emerged from Mrs. Fig's kitchen carrying a tea service, "that it's becoming increasingly difficult to keep your whereabouts secret. Word has a way of spreading, even in our community." Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. "Someone knows where we are." "Not yet," Mrs. Fig said, bustling in behind Lupin with a plate of biscuits that smelled of cinnamon and magic. "But there have been inquiries, people asking the right questions in the wrong places." Over the months, Harry had come to understand that Mrs. Fig's network of contacts was both vast and varied. Squibs, house elves, magical creatures who lived on the margins of wizarding society, They all seemed to pass information through channels that the ministry either couldn't access or didn't think to monitor. What kind of inquiries? Daphne's voice was carefully controlled, but Harry could hear the tension beneath it. The kind that suggests certain people are growing tired of your independent streak, Ragnok replied, looking up from their assignments. There are those who believe that children should not be permitted to make their own educational choices, regardless of their magical potential or intellectual capacity. And others, Marcus added grimly, who see you as symbols to be manipulated rather than people to be protected. Before Harry could ask what that meant, there was a soft tapping at the window. A small owl perched on the sill, a letter tied to its leg with ribbon that Harry recognized, Hogwarts, purple and bronze. Daphne went very still. That's Astoria's owl. Harry had learned about Astoria over the months. Daphne's younger sister sorted into Ravenclaw, trying to navigate Hogwarts while her sister's scandal echoed through pure blood society. Daphne had written to her several times, but the responses had been infrequent and carefully worded, clearly written under parental supervision. This letter felt different. Daphne opened the window with hands that trembled slightly, and the owl hopped inside, ruffling its feathers against the warmth. She untied the letter and unfolded it, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she read. "What is it?" Harry asked quietly. "Hogwarts is—" Daphne paused, reading the letter again. "Astoria says the school is dividing. Some students support what we did, leaving, choosing our own path. Others think we're traitors to the wizarding world." "That's not unexpected," Lupin said gently. "Change often creates division before it creates progress." Daphne continued reading, her frown deepening. "She says Neville Longbottom started some kind of study group. Students who want to learn about educational alternatives, about whether the house system really serves everyone." She looked up, her grey eyes wide. "Harry, she says they're calling it the Choice Movement." Harry felt something twist in his stomach, part pride, part terror. "We started a movement?" "Apparently," Daphne said, her voice slightly strangled. "And according to Astoria, some parents are demanding that Dumbledore expel the students involved." "And Dumbledore's response?" Mrs. Figg asked. "He's refusing. Says students have the right to discuss educational philosophy." Daphne's voice grew stronger. "But the school board is applying pressure, and some of the pure-blood families are threatening to withdraw their children if the Potter influence isn't contained." Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks. "The Potter influence?" "You walked away from the most prestigious magical institution in Britain," Ragnok said matter-of-factly. "Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" Before Harry could respond, another owl arrived, this one larger and more official-looking, with the unmistakable insignia of the Ministry of Magic on its message pouch. Mrs. Figg took the letter, her expression growing grim as she read. "Well," she said finally, "it seems the situation has escalated." "What now?" Marcus asked. "The ministry has officially classified Harry and Daphne as educational fugitives," Mrs. Figg said, her voice tight with anger. "There's a warrant for their return to proper wizarding custody." The silence that followed was profound. Harry felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. "Educational fugitives." "It means," Lupin said quietly, "that they're treating your choice to leave school as a form of truancy, punishable by magical law." "Can they do that?" Daphne asked. "They can try," Ragnok replied, his smile sharp and predatory. "Though I believe they'll find Goblin law has some interesting precedents regarding educational autonomy." Harry looked around the room at the people who'd become his teachers, his protectors, his chosen family. 3 months ago, he'd been a frightened 11-year-old walking away from everything he was supposed to want. Now he was still 11, still occasionally frightened, but he was also something else, someone who'd found his own path and helped others begin to question theirs. "So what do we do?" he asked. "We continue," Ferenzi said simply. "The stars do not change their course because others disapprove of their light." "Besides," Daphne added, folding Astoria's letter carefully, "it sounds like we're not alone anymore." She was right, Harry realized. Somewhere at Hogwarts, Neville Longbottom, the boy who'd looked terrified during his own sorting, was leading students in questioning the very system Harry had rejected. Other children were asking the same questions, making their own small rebellions, demanding their own choices. They'd started something bigger than just two 11-year-olds walking out of a great hall. "Right then," Mrs. Figg said briskly, gathering the official letters. "I suppose we'd better prepare for visitors, and perhaps it's time to introduce you to some of our more influential allies." "More allies?" Harry asked. "Oh yes, dear," Mrs. Figg said, with a smile that held more teeth than comfort. "Did you really think that a network capable of hiding two of the most famous children in magical Britain operated with just a handful of outcasts and a squib with too many cats?" As if summoned by her words, a house elf appeared in the centre of the room with a loud crack. Not Dobby this time, but a different elf, female, wearing what looked like a tea towel fashioned into a toga, with enormous eyes and an air of barely contained excitement. "Winky is bringing important message," the elf squeaked, "from the secret friends who help the brave young wizards." She held out a letter sealed with wax that bore no official seal, no family crest, nothing to identify its sender except for a small symbol that looked like a phoenix in flight. Harry took the letter with hands that had grown steadier over the months of magical training. Whatever this was, whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. He had Daphne, who'd learned to laugh and fight and think for herself. He had teachers who saw him as a student rather than a symbol. He had a community of magical beings who'd chosen to invest in his education and his future. Most importantly, he had the knowledge that somewhere at Hogwarts, other students were beginning to ask the same questions that had driven him from the castle 3 months ago. Change, Harry was learning, was rarely comfortable, but it was always worth it. He broke the seal and began to read, aware that whatever the letter contained, there truly was no going back now. They'd chosen their path, and now that path was choosing them in return. Chapter 6. The Hunt Begins. The letter with the phoenix seal had contained exactly 4 words. "They are coming tonight." Harry stared at the parchment for the 3rd time in as many minutes, as if the sparse message might somehow reveal additional information through sheer force of will. Beside him, Daphne was methodically checking the defensive charms on her wand, a habit she'd developed over the past month as their situation had grown increasingly precarious. "Any idea who they might be?" she asked, without looking up from her wand work. "Could be anyone," Mrs. Figg replied from across the room, where she was bustling about with the kind of determined efficiency that usually meant trouble. Ministry officials, Death Eaters, concerned parents with more money than sense. The possibilities are unfortunately numerous. Harry felt his stomach tighten. 3 months of intensive magical training had given him confidence in his abilities, but it had also taught him enough about magical combat to understand exactly how much he still didn't know. Marcus Belby's defensive lessons had been thorough, but they'd focused on protection and escape rather than actual fighting. At 11, Harry could maintain complex shield charms, create effective distractions, and communicate with most magical creatures. He was still, however, 11. "Protective wards are holding," Ragnarok announced from his position near the windows, where he'd been monitoring the goblin-crafted detection spells that surrounded Mrs. Figg's property. "But I'm detecting probe attempts. Someone is testing our defenses." "How long before they find a way through?" Daphne asked, finally satisfied with her wand's responsiveness. "Difficult to say. Goblin ward work is substantially more sophisticated than anything the Ministry typically encounters, but determined opponents have ways of—" Ragnarok's words were cut off by a sharp crack of disapparition from just outside the front door, then another, then several more in rapid succession. Mrs. Figg moved to the window with surprising speed for someone her age, peering through a gap in the curtains. Auras, she said tersely. 2 of them. One dark-skinned man, tall, calm-bearing. One young woman, pink hair, looks nervous. Harry felt a surge of fear mixed with something that might have been relief. Auras were dangerous, but they were also supposed to be the good guys. Death Eaters wouldn't have knocked. The knock, when it came, was firm but polite. Mrs. Fig? The voice was deep, cultured, with an accent that suggested good education. I'm Aura Shacklebolt. This is Aura Tonks. We'd like to speak with you about Harry Potter and Daphne Greengrass. Mrs. Fig exchanged glances with Lupin, who had emerged from the kitchen looking unusually tense. Let them in, he said quietly. Kingsley can be trusted. You know him? Harry asked. We've worked together, Lupin replied, which Harry had learned was his way of saying he'd tell them more later, if there was a later. Mrs. Fig opened the door to reveal 2 figures in the dark robes of Aura service. The man was indeed tall and imposing, with an air of quiet authority that reminded Harry of the better teachers he'd encountered. The woman was younger, perhaps in her early 20s, with bright pink hair that seemed to shift colour slightly in the light. Mrs. Fig, Aura Shacklebolt said with a slight bow, thank you for agreeing to speak with us. I haven't agreed to anything yet, Mrs. Fig replied crisply. State your business. The pink-haired Aura, Tonks, shifted nervously. We're here about the children, Harry Potter and Daphne Greengrass. What about them? Shacklebolt's expression grew grave. Mrs. Fig, I'm going to speak plainly. Officially, we're here to execute a warrant for their return to proper wizarding custody. Unofficially, he paused, glancing around the room. We're here to warn them. Harry felt Daphne tense beside him. Warn us about what? The Ministry's patience has run out, Tonks said, her young face troubled. Minister Fudge has authorized the use of force to retrieve you. There are teams being assembled as we speak. And unofficially, Mrs. Fig asked. Shacklebolt's jaw tightened. Unofficially, there are those of us who believe that children shouldn't be dragged back to school by magical law enforcement, particularly not children who've demonstrated such initiative in their educational choices. You support what we did? Daphne asked, surprise clear in her voice. I support, Shacklebolt said carefully, the right of young people to make informed decisions about their futures. I also support the idea that perhaps our educational system could benefit from the kind of questions you've been asking. Before anyone could respond, the air in the room suddenly felt thick and oppressive. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Harry caught the unmistakable scent of something dark and wrong, like burning feathers mixed with old blood. Ragnar's head snapped up from his monitoring spells. Breach in the eastern perimeter. Multiple contacts, moving fast. How many? Marcus asked, appearing from the kitchen with his wand already drawn. At least 6, possibly more. Ragnar's face was grim. And they're not ministry. Shacklebolt cursed under his breath. Death Eaters. Harry felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Death Eaters, Voldemort's followers, coming for him specifically, just like they'd come for his parents. Why? Daphne's voice was steady, despite the fear Harry could see in her grey eyes. Why would they want us? Because, Lupin said quietly, you've become symbols, either symbols of resistance to be eliminated or tools to be captured and used. The first explosion came without warning, a crack of destructive magic that shook the entire house and sent several of Mrs. Fig's enchanted ornaments tumbling to the floor. The wards had been breached. Back exit, Mrs. Fig said tersely, but even as she spoke, the sound of splintering wood came from the rear of the house. Surrounded, Marcus observed, with the kind of calm that came from experience with genuinely bad situations. Harry's training kicked in without conscious thought. Over the months, he'd learned that panic was the enemy of effective magic, that clear thinking and proper technique could overcome raw power, that working with allies was always better than fighting alone. He raised his wand and cast the strongest shield charm he could manage, feeling Daphne's magic join with his, A moment later, the front door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and dark light. 3 figures in black robes and silver masks swept through the opening, moving with the fluid coordination of people who'd done this many times before. "Harry Potter," the lead figure said, and his voice carried the kind of cold amusement that made Harry's skin crawl. "How thoughtful of you to make this so easy." Shacklebolt and Tonks moved immediately, their aura training evident in the precision of their spellwork. Stunning spells and binding curses flew across the room, met by shields and counter-curses from the Death Eaters. The air filled with the acrid smell of magical combat and the sharp reports of spells impacting barriers. Harry found himself fighting beside Daphne, their months of practice together, making their movements almost instinctive. She favored binding spells and clever diversions, magic that used an opponent's momentum against them, while Harry focused on shields and protection, creating safe spaces for their allies to work from. "Very good," the lead Death Eater said, deflecting one of Daphne's binding curses with contemptuous ease. "The children have been training. How amusing." More figures appeared from the back of the house, 2 more Death Eaters moving to flank them. Harry realized with growing terror that they were seriously outnumbered by people with decades more experience in magical combat. "Dobby!" Harry called out, hoping desperately that the house elf could hear him. There was a loud crack, and suddenly Dobby stood in the center of the chaos, his tennis ball eyes blazing with fury. "Bad wizards will not hurt Harry Potter," he squeaked, and the nearest Death Eater was suddenly hurling through the air, slammed into the far wall by house elf magic that was apparently much more powerful than anyone had expected. The distraction gave Lupin the opening he needed. The werewolf's spell work was nothing like the careful, academic magic Harry had seen at Hogwarts. It was wild, instinctive, and devastatingly effective. 2 Death Eaters went down under a barrage of curses that seemed to come from every direction at once. But there were still too many of them, and more were appearing outside the shattered windows. Harry could feel his magical strength beginning to flag under the strain of maintaining multiple shields, and beside him, Daphne was breathing hard from the effort of her complex spellwork. "We need to leave," Marcus called out, ducking under a curse that turned the wall behind him into smoking slag. "Now." "Where?" Mrs. Figg asked, even as she directed what looked like a flock of enchanted china plates to attack the Death Eaters nearest the windows. Before anyone could answer, the air shimmered with golden light, and forks materialized above them. The Phoenix's song cut through the chaos of battle like a blade, and Harry felt his magical strength surge back to full intensity. More importantly, he felt the Death Eater's spells beginning to weaken. Phoenix song, he remembered Firenze telling him, was anathema to dark magic. "Fascinating," said a new voice from the doorway, cold, cultured, and entirely too calm for the circumstances. "I had wondered what would happen if the Potter boy was properly cornered." Lucius Malfoy stepped through the ruined entrance, his pale eyes surveying the scene with the detached interest of someone watching a mildly entertaining play. He wasn't wearing a Death Eater mask, but the way the other dark wizards deferred to him made his allegiance clear. "Mr. Malfoy," Shacklebolt said tightly, his wand trained on the man's chest, "I should arrest you." "But you won't," Malfoy replied with supreme confidence, "because you're outnumbered, outgunned, and protecting 2 children who are currently classified as fugitives from wizarding justice." Harry felt rage building in his chest, not the hot, explosive anger of childhood, but something colder and more focused. This man had orchestrated the attack on their sanctuary, had brought Death Eaters to threaten the people who'd shown them kindness. "What do you want?" Harry asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Cooperation," Malfoy replied smoothly. "You've caused considerable disruption, young Potter. Certain parties would prefer to see that disruption channeled in more productive directions." "We're not going back to Hogwarts," Daphne said firmly. "Oh, my dear girl." Malfoy's smile was sharp as winter. "Who said anything about Hogwarts?" The implications of his words hit Harry like a physical blow. They didn't want to force him back to school. They wanted to recruit him, use him. turn him into a symbol for their own purposes. Never, Harry said. Pity, Malfoy sighed. I had hoped you might be reasonable. He raised his wand, but before he could cast, the air exploded with silver light and thunderous hoofbeats. Firenze burst through the far wall, literally through it, the stones parting like water before centaur magic, his bow drawn and arrow nocked. Enough! The centaur's voice carried the weight of ancient forests and eternal stars, and every Death Eater in the room froze as though suddenly encased in ice. You dare, Firenze said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout, to bring dark magic into a place of learning, to threaten children under the protection of the old laws? Malfoy's composure cracked slightly. This is not centaur territory. All places where knowledge is shared freely are centaur territory, Firenze replied, and his arrow was suddenly wreathed in silver fire. All children who seek to learn, rather than to destroy, are under our protection. The battle that followed was brief and decisive. Centaur magic was older than wizard magic, more primal, less constrained by human notions of what was possible. Firenze's arrows never seemed to miss, and where they struck, Death Eaters simply stopped. Not killed, not even injured visibly, but frozen in place as though time itself had abandoned them. In less than 2 minutes, every Death Eater except Malfoy was immobilized. This isn't over, Potter, Malfoy said, backing toward the ruined doorway. You cannot hide forever. Perhaps not, Firenze said calmly, another arrow appearing on his bowstring without any visible effort. But they can hide long enough to grow strong enough to choose their own battles. Malfoy disapparated with a sharp crack, and suddenly the room was quiet except for the sound of labored breathing and settling debris. Harry looked around at the destruction. Mrs. Figg's beautiful sitting room was barely recognizable, filled with broken furniture and scorch marks, and felt a crushing weight of guilt settle on his shoulders. I'm sorry, he said quietly. This is all my fault. Nonsense, Mrs. Figg said briskly, surveying the damage with the air of someone already planning repairs. This is what happens when you stand up to bullies, dear. They escalate. But your home can be rebuilt, she interrupted firmly. And will be. What matters is that you're both safe. Harry looked at Lupin, who was leaning heavily against the remains of a bookshelf, one hand pressed to his side, where dark stains were spreading through his robes. Professor? I'll be fine, Lupin said, though his voice was tight with pain. Healing potions exist for a reason. But Harry could see the cost of their choice, written in the lines of exhaustion around Lupin's eyes, in the tremor in Mrs. Figg's hands as she began clearing debris, in the way Daphne was unconsciously staying close to his side. We can't keep doing this, Daphne said quietly, echoing his thoughts. Putting everyone at risk. No, Harry agreed. We need better protection. Stronger allies. Actually, Ragnok said, emerging from behind an overturned table with his monitoring equipment somehow still intact. I believe I know exactly who you need to speak with. Who? The goblin's smile was sharp and predatory. My king. Chapter 7. The Goblin Gambit. Gringotts at midnight was a very different place than the bustling bank Harry remembered from his shopping trip with Hagrid. The marble halls echoed with their footsteps as Ragnok led them through corridors that seemed to stretch deeper into the earth than should have been possible. The goblin guards they passed wore expressions of grim determination rather than their usual professional courtesy. Sanctuary, Ragnok explained as they walked, is an ancient right predating any human magical law. Once granted, it cannot be revoked by wizard authority, no matter how powerful. Daphne stayed close to Harry's side, her hand resting on her wand in a gesture that had become habitual since the Death Eater attack. Her grey eyes took in everything: the armed guards, the unfamiliar corridors, the subtle signs of a bank preparing for siege. And your king agreed to this? She asked quietly. King Ragnok V sees opportunity where others see crisis, Ragnok replied, with something that might have been pride. the wizarding world has grown complacent in its assumptions about goblin loyalty. They descended further. Past vaults Harry was certain no human customer had ever seen, until they reached a chamber that took his breath away. The space was vast, carved from living rock, and lit by crystals that seemed to hold their own inner fire. At the center sat a figure who could only be the Goblin King. Ragnarok V was ancient by any standard Harry could comprehend. His face seamed with lines that spoke of centuries of accumulated wisdom and carefully controlled anger. He wore robes of midnight blue, shot through with silver thread, and when he looked at Harry, his dark eyes held depths that reminded Harry uncomfortably of Dumbledore. Except where Dumbledore's gaze had always felt calculating, the Goblin King's felt simply knowing. "Harry Potter," the king said, his voice carrying the weight of formal ceremony. "Son of James, grandson of Fleamont, you seek sanctuary among the Goblin nation." "I do, your majesty," Harry replied, grateful that his months of alternative education had included lessons in proper protocol for addressing magical royalty. "And you, Daphne Greengrass, daughter of Cyrus, granddaughter of Abraxas, do you also seek our protection?" Harry felt Daphne straighten beside him. "I do, your majesty, though I confess I'm surprised you know my lineage so precisely." The Goblin King's smile held more teeth than warmth. "Child, goblins have been managing wizard family finances for over a millennium. We know bloodlines better than most wizards know their own family trees." His expression grew more serious. "The question is whether you understand what sanctuary among our people entails." "What do you mean?" Harry asked. "I mean," said Griphook, emerging from behind one of the crystal formations, "that sanctuary comes with revelations. Protection requires truth. And truth, as you are about to discover, has been somewhat selectively presented to you both." The goblin held a key that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight. "This belongs to you, Harry Potter. It opens a vault that your father established shortly before his death, a vault that certain parties have been most eager to keep you from discovering." Harry felt his pulse quicken. "A secret vault?" "The Potter family vault was never secret," Griphook corrected. "It was simply mislabeled in the public records. What you accessed during your first visit to Gringotts was a trust vault, established for your everyday expenses. The family vault contains considerably more." They travelled deeper still, in a cart that moved with the smooth efficiency of goblin engineering. The tunnel walls were carved with symbols Harry didn't recognize, and the air grew thick with the weight of ancient magic. Finally, they stopped before a door that bore the Potter family crest, a stag's head surrounded by runes that seemed to shift and change as Harry watched. "Place your hand on the crest," Griphook instructed. "The vault recognizes blood, not just ki." The moment Harry's palm touched the carved stone, the door swung open with silent grace, revealing a chamber that made his trust vault look like a child's piggy bank. Gold lay in carefully organized stacks, but that wasn't what caught his attention. The walls were lined with bookshelves, weapon racks, and display cases containing artifacts that hummed with barely contained magic. "Bloody hell," Daphne breathed, then immediately flushed. "Forgive me, your majesty." "In this context," the Goblin King said with dry amusement, "the expression seems appropriate." Harry moved toward the nearest bookshelf, drawn by titles he couldn't read and covers that seemed to whisper with old knowledge. But it was the desk in the center of the vault that stopped him cold, a massive piece of dark wood whose surface was covered with papers, maps, and what looked like detailed genealogical charts. "Your father," Griphook said quietly, "was not simply a Gryffindor who died fighting the Dark Lord. He was a researcher, an investigator who had begun to uncover some very disturbing truths about the wizarding world's power structures." Harry picked up the top document from the desk, a letter in his father's handwriting, addressed to someone called R.J.L. The date was October 30th, 1981. The night before his parents died. "Remus," he said softly, recognizing the initials. This was meant for Professor Lupin. "Read it," the Goblin King instructed. Harry's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the parchment and began to read aloud. Remus, if you're reading this, then Lily and I are probably dead, and our son is likely being raised by people who know nothing about his true heritage. By now, Dumbledore has undoubtedly spun some story about the greater good, about necessary sacrifices, about how everything was done to protect Harry. Don't believe him. Daphne moved to Harry's shoulder, reading along as he continued. The Potter family has been tracking Dark Lord activities for 3 generations. What we've discovered is that Voldemort's rise to power was not the random emergence of a dark wizard, but the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign that involves people Dumbledore considers allies, people he protects. Harry's voice caught. The prophecy was real, but Dumbledore's interpretation of it was deliberately incomplete. Harry is not a weapon to be wielded against the Dark Lord. He is the key to exposing the corruption that allowed the Dark Lord to flourish. What does that mean? Harry asked, looking up from the letter. It means, said Ragnok, that your father discovered evidence of systematic corruption within the Ministry, the Wizengamot, and even the Order of the Phoenix. Evidence that certain pure-blood families have been playing both sides of every conflict for decades, growing rich and powerful while ordinary wizards suffered. Daphne had gone very pale. Which families? Griphook consulted a ledger that seemed to appear in his hands from nowhere. The Malfoys, certainly. The Blacks. Several members of the Wizengamot. And he paused, his dark eyes fixing on Daphne with something that might have been sympathy. The Greengrass family has been paying tribute to dark wizards for over 2 centuries. The silence that followed was profound. Harry watched Daphne's face cycle through shock, denial, and finally a kind of terrible understanding. Tribute? She asked quietly. Protection money, the Goblin King said bluntly. Your family's neutrality in conflicts has been purchased by ensuring that dark wizards had access to funding, safe houses, and political intelligence. You were never taught pure blood supremacy out of genuine belief, child. You were taught it because your family's survival has always depended on appearing to support whichever side seemed strongest. Daphne sank into a chair that someone, Harry wasn't sure who, had conjured for her. That's why my parents were so angry about my choice, not because I'd embarrassed them, but because I'd made us vulnerable. Precisely, Griphook confirmed, and it's why both of your situations are more precarious than you've understood. Harry, there are parties who want you dead because of what your father discovered. Daphne, there are others who want your family destroyed because of what you now represent. A pure blood who has publicly rejected the system they depend on. Harry felt overwhelmed. 3 months ago, his biggest concern had been avoiding Dudley's fists. Now, apparently, he was heir to some kind of anti-corruption investigation that had gotten his parents killed. There's more, Ragnok said, leading them to another section of the vault. Training materials, magical artifacts that have been in your family for generations, and evidence that Dumbledore has been systematically restricting access to your inheritance. Harry stared at the assembled items. Books on advanced defensive magic, artifacts that pulsed with protective enchantments, and a sword that seemed to sing with its own inner voice. He's been keeping this from me. For your own protection, he would claim, the Goblin King said. But protection from what? Knowledge? Power? Or simply from the ability to make your own informed choices? Before Harry could respond, there was a disturbance from the entrance to the chamber. A young goblin messenger appeared, slightly out of breath and bearing several letters. Your Majesty, the messenger said with a formal bow. Urgent correspondence from the human world. Multiple sources. The Goblin King examined the letters, his expression growing increasingly interested. It would appear, he said finally, that your influence has been spreading faster than even we anticipated. What do you mean? Daphne asked. 3 letters from Hogwarts students, Luna Lovegood of Ravenclaw, Hannah Abbott of Hufflepuff, and Susan Bones, also of Hufflepuff. all asking for information about alternative educational arrangements. Harry felt his chest tighten with something between pride and terror. They want to leave Hogwarts too? More than that, the Goblin King said, consulting another message. According to our sources within the school, nearly 30% of the first through third year students have signed some sort of petition supporting educational choice. The Hogwarts Board of Governors has called an emergency meeting. 30%? Daphne's voice was barely audible. Your departure was not an isolated incident of adolescent rebellion, Griphook explained. It was the catalyst that revealed how many young wizards have been questioning the current system. The Potter name carries weight, and when Harry Potter walks away from Hogwarts, others notice. The implications were staggering. Harry had thought they were two children making a personal choice about their education. Instead, they'd apparently started some kind of revolution. "There's one more thing," the Goblin King said, and his tone had grown very serious indeed. "A proposition." "What kind of proposition?" Harry asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Goblin citizenship," King Ragnarok said simply. "Full legal protection under Goblin law, access to Goblin education and resources, and independence from wizard legal authority." Harry stared at him. "Is that even possible?" "Goblins have the right to grant citizenship to humans who have provided significant service to our nation," Griphook explained. "Your father's research into corruption included evidence of systematic discrimination against Goblin-run businesses, magical creatures, and non-human magical beings. His work could be used to demand significant legal reforms." "And in return?" Daphne asked. "In return," the Goblin King said, "you would become the first human citizens of the Goblin Nation in over 300 years. You would be untouchable by wizard law, able to pursue your education and your father's research under our protection." Harry looked at Daphne, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her grey eyes. "Goblin citizenship would mean safety, resources, and the ability to continue learning without fear of forced return to Hogwarts. It would also mean leaving humanity behind." "How long do we have to decide?" Harry asked. "The offer remains open," the Goblin King said. "But the forces arrayed against you grow stronger each day. And if the reports from Hogwarts are accurate, you may soon have more than your own safety to consider." As if summoned by his words, another messenger appeared, this one carrying a single letter bearing the Hogwarts seal. Harry opened it with trembling fingers and read, "Harry, Daphne. The school is in chaos. Dumbledore has called an assembly to address the educational choice movement. Some families are threatening to withdraw their children if the administration doesn't condemn your actions. Others are demanding the right to pursue alternative education themselves. We need you to know that you're not alone. Whatever you do next, remember that change is happening here because of the choice you made. We support you. Neville, Luna, Hannah, Susan, and 47 others." Harry handed the letter to Daphne, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a cloak made of lead. They weren't just choosing their own futures anymore. They were choosing the future of magical education itself. "No pressure," Daphne said quietly, reading the letter for the second time. "None at all," Harry agreed, and despite everything, found himself smiling. Whatever choice they made, they'd make it together. Chapter 8. The Choice of Nations. The summons came at dawn, not the polite request that might have been expected for a diplomatic meeting, but the sharp, imperious demand of a government that had run out of patience. Minister Cornelius Fudge's letter, delivered by a ministry owl that looked as frazzled as its sender probably felt, contained exactly the sort of ultimatum Harry had learned to expect from people who confused authority with wisdom. "Return the Potter boy and the Greengrass girl immediately," Harry read aloud from the official parchment, "or face the consequences of harboring fugitives from wizarding justice." The Goblin King's expression, as he listened to the letter, was the sort of calm that preceded either magnificent diplomacy or spectacular warfare. King Ragnarok V had been dealing with wizard politicians for longer than the British ministry had existed, and his patience for their threats was evidently finite. "Consequences," the king repeated, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Minister Fudge threatens consequences to the goblin nation." Daphne, who had been studying a copy of goblin legal codes since before sunrise, looked up from her reading with the expression of someone who had discovered something particularly interesting. "Your Majesty, according to the Treaty of 1612, threats against goblin sovereignty constitute grounds for immediate cessation of all banking services to the threatening party." "Precisely," Griphook said with a smile that showed entirely too many sharp teeth. "The minister seems to have forgotten that Gringotts controls roughly 70% of the gold in Wizarding Britain. Without goblin banking services, the wizarding economy would collapse within a fortnight." Harry felt a strange mixture of admiration and unease as he watched Daphne and the goblins discuss the political implications of their situation. 3 months of intensive education had taught her not just magical lore and ancient runes, but also the kind of strategic thinking that came from understanding how power actually worked. She was still 11 years old, but she was 11 years old with the political education of someone twice her age. "The minister wouldn't actually declare war," Harry said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "Fudge might not," King Ragnarok replied, "but there are others who would welcome an excuse for conflict, others who have been waiting for an opportunity to seize goblin assets and claim our territories." Before Harry could ask who he meant, alarms began sounding throughout Gringotts. Not the sharp bells that announced robbery attempts, but deeper, more ominous tones that spoke of threats to the institution itself. "What's happening?" Daphne asked. "Visitors," Griphook said grimly. "The kind who don't wait for invitations." They made their way to the main hall of the bank, where Harry could see through the tall windows that Diagon Alley had been cordoned off by Aurors. The sight of so many magical law enforcement officers in full combat gear made his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. This was what war preparations looked like. But it was the figure walking calmly through the cordon, unescorted and apparently unbothered by the martial atmosphere, that made Harry's breath catch. Dumbledore. The headmaster approached the main entrance of Gringotts with his usual measured pace, his blue eyes serene behind half-moon spectacles. He looked, Harry thought, like a man coming to collect something that belonged to him. "Harry," Dumbledore said as he entered the main hall, his voice carrying the warm familiarity that had once made Harry feel safe. "My boy, I believe it's time we had a proper conversation." "About what?" Harry asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "About choices," Dumbledore replied gently. "About the difference between wisdom and adolescent rebellion. About the responsibilities that come with the Potter name." Harry felt Daphne move slightly closer to his side. Not obviously, just a subtle shift that reminded him he wasn't facing this alone. The gesture gave him the courage to say what he'd been thinking since reading his father's letter. "You mean about the responsibilities you've been hiding from me?" Something flickered in Dumbledore's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "I'm not sure what you mean, Harry." "I mean my father's research." Harry's voice was growing stronger. "I mean the vault you've kept me from accessing. I mean the evidence about corruption in the ministry that got my parents killed." The silence that followed was profound. Harry could see auras shifting nervously outside the windows, could feel the goblins around them growing tenser. But Dumbledore's expression remained perfectly calm. "The world," Dumbledore said finally, "is more complex than children should have to understand, Harry. Some knowledge is burden rather than gift." "Who decides that?" Daphne asked, her voice carrying the crisp authority she'd learned from months of studying magical law. "Who gave you the right to determine what Harry should know about his own heritage?" Dumbledore's gaze shifted to her, and Harry caught something in the headmaster's expression that he'd never noticed before. a kind of calculating assessment that had nothing to do with grandfatherly concern. "Miss Greengrass," Dumbledore said, "I understand that recent revelations about your family's arrangements have been distressing, but surely you can see that some traditions exist for good reasons?" "You mean the tradition of paying protection money to dark wizards?" Daphne's voice was deadly quiet. "The tradition of maintaining neutrality by funding both sides of every conflict? Those traditions?" Harry stared at her. He'd known about her family's situation from their conversation with the Goblin King, but hearing her state it so boldly was different. This was Daphne publicly rejecting not just her upbringing, but everything her family had been for generations. The Greengrass family's political positions have always been nuanced, Dumbledore replied carefully. The Greengrass family's political positions have always been cowardly, Daphne corrected. And profitable. But that ends with me. Before Dumbledore could respond, King Ragnarok stepped forward, his ancient face grim with purpose. "Headmaster Dumbledore," the Goblin King said formally, "you stand in Goblin territory, making demands about Goblin guests. By what authority?" "By the authority," Dumbledore said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "of someone who understands the larger picture. These children are playing with forces beyond their comprehension." "What forces?" Harry asked. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying Harry's face as though searching for something. Finally he spoke. "Voldemort is not as defeated as the wizarding world believes, Harry. His followers remain active, and they see you as either a threat to be eliminated or a tool to be claimed. Your departure from Hogwarts has removed you from the protections I established there." Harry felt cold settling in his stomach. "What kind of protections?" "Blood wards, ancient magic tied to your mother's sacrifice. Magic that requires you to consider Hogwarts your home." "But I don't," Harry said simply. "I never did." "Which is why," Dumbledore continued, "you are now vulnerable in ways you cannot imagine." Griphook cleared his throat with the sound of metal on stone. "Headmaster, Goblin wards are considerably older than blood magic. Mr. Potter is under the protection of laws that predate human magical theory by millennia." "Goblin magic," Dumbledore said, with the first hint of irritation Harry had ever heard in his voice, "has never faced the specific threat that Tom Riddle represents." "Tom Riddle?" Daphne asked. "Voldemort's birth name," Dumbledore explained. "A brilliant student who became consumed by the desire for power and immortality. A student who learned, among other things, how to split his soul." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. He'd heard hints about Horcruxes from Firenze, fragments of centaur prophecy that spoke of torn souls and anchor objects. But hearing it confirmed, hearing Dumbledore speak of it so matter-of-factly, made the threat real in a way it hadn't been before. "Split his soul." Harry's voice came out smaller than he'd intended. "Horcruxes," Dumbledore said quietly. "Objects that contain fragments of a wizard's soul, ensuring that even death cannot claim them completely. As long as the Horcruxes exist, Tom Riddle cannot truly die." Harry felt the weight of this revelation settling on his shoulders. "And you think he's coming back?" "I know he's coming back," Dumbledore corrected. "The question is whether you'll be prepared when he does." It was then that King Ragnarok produced a file from nowhere, the kind of thick document folder that suggested extensive investigation. "Headmaster," the Goblin King said, "you speak of threats and protection, but Goblin intelligence suggests that the greatest threat to these children comes not from the Dark Lord's eventual return, but from those who claim to oppose him." Dumbledore went very still. "I beg your pardon?" "Ministry officials who profit from instability, pure-blood families who play all sides, even members of your own order who see these children as convenient tools rather than people to be protected." Griphook opened the file, revealing documents that made Harry's blood run cold. Ministry memos discussing containment protocols for Harry Potter, Financial records showing payments from Lucius Malfoy to Cornelius Fudge. Most damning of all, correspondence between Death Eaters and Ministry officials that suggested coordination rather than opposition. This, King Ragnarok said, is why we offered goblin citizenship. Not to steal children from their proper education, but to protect them from those who would use them. Dumbledore studied the documents, his face growing increasingly grave. Where did you obtain these? Goblin intelligence networks are extensive, Griphook replied. We have been tracking the activities of those who threaten our interests. Lately, that includes those who threaten our newest allies. Harry looked at the evidence spread before him. Proof that the ministry he was supposed to trust was compromised, that even some members of the Order of the Phoenix were not what they seemed. The weight of it was overwhelming. So what do we do? He asked. It was Daphne who answered, her voice steady with the kind of certainty that came from months of studying law and politics. We reject the goblin citizenship, she said, and Harry felt his heart skip. But we negotiate our own terms. Daphne, Harry began. Think about it, she interrupted. Goblin citizenship would protect us, but it would also remove us from wizarding society entirely. We couldn't help the students who want educational choice. We couldn't continue the work your father started. We'd be safe, but we'd be irrelevant. Harry stared at her, seeing the political calculation in her grey eyes. 3 months ago, she'd been a pure-blood heiress who'd never questioned her family's expectations. Now she was thinking like a strategist. What terms? Dumbledore asked, and Harry caught the note of wariness in his voice. Legal recognition of our right to alternative education, Daphne said, protection from forced return to Hogwarts, and full access to Harry's family vault and research. That's not, Dumbledore began. That's not negotiable, Harry finished, surprising himself with his own firmness. Those are our terms. Take them or leave them. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of political consequences and personal choice. Finally, Dumbledore nodded slowly. Very well. But you must understand, this path you're choosing, it will not be safe. It will not be easy, and it may cost you more than you're prepared to pay. Before Harry could respond, there was a commotion from the entrance to the bank, the sound of arguing voices, of spells being cast, of someone forcing their way past Auror cordons with single-minded determination. What in Merlin's name? Griphook began. The doors of Gringotts burst open, and a figure stumbled through, tall, gaunt, with long dark hair and wild eyes that fixed immediately on Harry with desperate intensity. Harry, the man said, his voice rough with emotion. My godson? Harry stared at the stranger, something deep in his chest recognizing the man even as his mind struggled to place him. There was something familiar about the sharp cheekbones, the aristocratic bearing that even exhaustion and desperation couldn't quite hide. Who? Harry began. Sirius Black, Dumbledore said quietly, his voice filled with something that sounded almost like resignation. Harry, meet your godfather. Chapter 9. Family and Blood. The man who claimed to be Sirius Black looked nothing like the dangerous fugitive Harry had seen on wanted posters. He was gaunt to the point of emaciation, his dark hair tangled and unkempt, his clothes torn and travel-stained. But his eyes, grey eyes that held depths of pain and desperate hope, those were unmistakably alive in a way that spoke of someone who had endured hell and emerged with his sanity intact. Prove it, Dumbledore said quietly, his wand drawn but not yet pointed at the newcomer. Prove you are who you claim to be. Sirius laughed, and the sound held no humor whatsoever. Still don't trust anyone, do you, Albus? Still assume everyone is lying until they prove otherwise? He turned to Harry, and his expression softened. Your father had a scar on his shoulder, shaped like a lightning bolt. Got it when he was 7, trying to impress your mother by climbing the tallest tree in the Potter estate. Harry felt something twist in his chest. Anyone could have known that. Anyone could have, Sirius agreed. But not everyone would know that he told Lily he'd gotten it fighting a dragon, and she laughed at him for 10 minutes straight before healing it herself. His smile was sad and genuine. She always could see through his dramatics. Dumbledore's wand lowered slightly. "How did you escape Azkaban?" "I didn't escape," Sirius said, his voice turning hard. "I was never supposed to be there in the first place. I've spent 12 years in that nightmare because you—" He pointed a finger at Dumbledore that shook with barely controlled rage. "Because you were so convinced of your own righteousness that you never bothered to investigate whether the evidence against me made sense." "The evidence was conclusive," Dumbledore began. "The evidence was fabricated," Sirius snapped, "by Peter Pettigrew, the real secret keeper, the rat who sold James and Lily to Voldemort and then framed me for the crime." Harry felt the world tilt around him. "Peter Pettigrew is alive?" "Very much so," Sirius said grimly. "Though not in human form most of the time. He's been hiding as a rat for 12 years, playing pet to a wizarding family while I rotted in Azkaban for his crimes." Griphook cleared his throat with a sound like grinding metal. "This can be verified through goblin truth detection, if needed." "It won't be necessary," Dumbledore said slowly, and Harry caught something in the headmaster's expression that looked almost like shame. "I suspected. In recent months, I have had occasion to doubt some of my earlier conclusions." "You suspected?" Sirius's voice rose to near shouting. "You suspected that an innocent man was in Azkaban, and you did nothing? I had no proof. You had no proof when you let them drag me there either." Sirius's control finally snapped completely. "You had the testimony of one man who conveniently died in the explosion that supposedly killed him, and you decided that was enough." Harry watched the exchange with growing horror. This wasn't just about one wrongful imprisonment. This was about a system that had failed so completely that an innocent man had spent 12 years surrounded by Dementors, while his true friend's betrayer lived free. "Sirius," Daphne said quietly, and something in her voice made both men stop shouting. "How do you know Peter Pettigrew is still alive?" Sirius turned to her, his expression shifting to something that might have been respect. "Because I've been tracking him. The moment I realized he had to be alive, the moment I understood that he was the only one who could have betrayed the Potters, I started hunting." He reached into his robes and withdrew a photograph that had clearly seen better days. It showed a family standing in front of what looked like the burrow, red-haired parents with several children, including a boy of about 11 holding a plump rat. "The Weasley family," Sirius said. "Good people, salt of the earth. No idea that their son's pet rat is actually the wizard who murdered his best friends." Harry stared at the photograph, remembering his brief encounter with the Weasley family at King's Cross. Ron Weasley had been carrying a rat, he recalled, an ordinary-looking rat that had seemed completely unremarkable. "How can you be sure?" Harry asked. "Because," Sirius said, "Animagus transformations leave magical signatures, and because Peter Pettigrew was never officially registered as an Animagus, which means the Ministry has no record of what his animal form looks like." Before anyone could respond to this revelation, the sound of multiple apparitions came from the main hall of Gringotts, not the sharp cracks of aura arrival, but the more elegant sound of coordinated group travel that spoke of careful planning and substantial magical power. "Oh, wonderful," Daphne muttered, her face going pale. "I know that arrival pattern." Through the tall windows, Harry could see a group of witches and wizards in expensive robes approaching the bank's entrance. They moved with the kind of coordinated arrogance that marked them immediately as pure-blood aristocracy, and at their head was a man Harry recognized as Lord Greengrass. "Your father?" Harry asked. "My father," Daphne confirmed, "and half the sacred 28, by the look of it." King Ragnarok's expression grew dangerous. "They dare to bring political pressure to bear within goblin territory?" They dare to do whatever they think will work, Daphne said, her voice steady, despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. The question is what we do about it. The delegation entered Gringotts with the kind of confident authority that suggested they expected immediate deference. Lord Greengrass led the group, but Harry could see other faces he recognized from the Prophet Society pages, Lady Selwyn, Lord Knott, and behind them all, moving like a pale shadow, Lucius Malfoy. "Daphne," Lord Greengrass said, his voice carrying across the marble hall, "this foolishness ends now." "Does it?" Daphne asked, and Harry was struck by how much she sounded like her father when she wanted to, the same crisp authority, the same aristocratic certainty. "I was under the impression that I had made my position quite clear." "You are 11 years old," Lady Selwyn interjected, her voice sharp with disdain. "You are not qualified to make positions about anything." "She's qualified to make decisions about her own education," Harry said, stepping forward to stand beside Daphne. "That's what this is about." Lucius Malfoy's pale eyes fixed on Harry with the kind of predatory interest that made his skin crawl. "Ah, young Potter, still convinced that your celebrity grants you the right to overturn centuries of wizarding tradition?" "I'm convinced," Harry replied. "That tradition isn't worth preserving when it's built on corruption and cowardice." The silence that followed his words was arctic. Harry could see several of the pure-blood lords exchanging glances that spoke of offence taken and consequences to be delivered. "Corruption?" Lord Knott's voice was dangerously quiet. "Yes," Daphne said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Corruption. The kind that has my family paying protection money to dark wizards. The kind that has ministry officials taking bribes from Death Eaters. The kind that has convinced an entire social class that their blood makes them superior when all it really makes them is complicit." The words hung in the air like a physical challenge. Harry could see the shock ripple through the assembled purebloods, not just at what Daphne had said, but at the fact that she'd said it publicly, in front of witnesses who would spread the story throughout magical Britain within hours. "Daphne," Lord Greengrass said, his voice tight with warning, "you will retract those statements immediately." "No," Daphne said simply, "I won't." "Then you are no daughter of mine." Harry expected Daphne to flinch, to show some sign of pain at her father's rejection. Instead, she straightened, her chin lifting with the kind of pride that had nothing to do with bloodlines and everything to do with personal courage. "Good," she said clearly. "I'd rather be no daughter of yours than a coward who perpetuates a system built on fear and prejudice." The gasps from the assembled purebloods were audible, but it was Lucius Malfoy's reaction that caught Harry's attention. The man's pale eyes had narrowed, and his hand had moved to his wand in a gesture that spoke of barely controlled violence. "You realize," Malfoy said softly, "that there are consequences for betraying one's class, Miss Greengrass. Consequences that extend beyond mere social ostracism." "Is that a threat?" Sirius asked. And suddenly Harry realized that his godfather had moved to flank the pure-blood delegation. The man might look like he'd been through hell, but his wand was steady in his hand, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd faced down dark wizards before. "It's a statement of fact," Malfoy replied. "The wizarding world has ways of dealing with those who threaten its stability." "Like sending innocent men to Azkaban?" Sirius's voice was deadly quiet. "Like framing them for crimes they didn't commit while the real traitors walk free?" Malfoy's composure cracked slightly. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I'm sure you do," Sirius said. "I'm sure you know exactly who the real secret keeper was. I'm sure you knew Peter Pettigrew was alive when they dragged me off to prison. The question is what else you know." Before Malfoy could respond, King Ragnarok stepped forward with the kind of authority that reminded everyone present that they were standing in Goblin territory, under Goblin law. "This discussion is concluded," the Goblin King announced. "Lord Greengrass, you and your associates will leave. Now." "You have no authority over British wizards," Lord Knott protested. "Within these walls, King Ragnarok replied with a smile that showed entirely too many sharp teeth. "I have absolute authority, and I am exercising it. Leave." The pureblood delegation began to withdraw, their defeat obvious in the stiffness of their postures and the careful way they avoided looking at Daphne. But Lucius Malfoy lingered for a moment, his pale eyes fixed on Harry with something that looked almost like amusement. "Enjoy your temporary sanctuary, Potter," he said softly. "But remember that sanctuaries can become prisons quite easily." As the purebloods departed, Harry felt the weight of what had just happened settling on his shoulders. Daphne had publicly and permanently severed her connections to pure blood society. There would be no going back from this, no possibility of reconciliation. "Are you all right?" he asked her quietly. "I'm free," she replied, and her voice held a kind of wonder that reminded Harry of his own first moments of freedom from Privet Drive. "For the first time in my life, I'm actually free." Sirius was watching this exchange with something that looked like approval. "Your parents would have understood," he said to Harry. James and Lily faced a similar choice near the end, between the expectations of the wizarding world and what they knew to be right. "What do you mean?" Harry asked. "I mean they'd begun to question Dumbledore's leadership," Sirius said bluntly. "The war wasn't going well, and your father had started to suspect that someone in the Order was feeding information to Voldemort. He'd been conducting his own investigation." "The research in the vault," Harry said, understanding. "More than that," Sirius said. "He'd discovered evidence that Voldemort had found ways to cheat death. Dark magic, ancient rituals, things that made him effectively immortal as long as certain conditions were met." Dumbledore had gone very still. "James told you about the Horcruxes?" "He told me enough," Sirius replied. "Enough to know that killing Voldemort wouldn't be enough. Enough to know that someone would need to hunt down the objects he'd hidden his soul fragments in." Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. "And he was going to do it? Hunt down the Horcruxes?" "He was going to try," Sirius said. "But first, he needed to ensure you were safe. He needed to make sure that if anything happened to him and Lily, you'd be protected by people who understood what you were up against." "People like you?" Daphne asked. "People like me," Sirius confirmed, "which is why Peter's betrayal was so devastating. It didn't just kill James and Lily, it destroyed the entire support network they'd built for Harry." Harry stared at his godfather, feeling the weight of family history settling around him like a cloak. His parents hadn't just died fighting Voldemort, they'd died trying to create a better world for him to grow up in. "There's more," Sirius said quietly. James's research suggested that Voldemort wasn't working alone in his preparations for immortality. Someone at Hogwarts was helping him. "Who?" Dumbledore asked, his voice sharp with concern. "Someone with access to the library, to the students, to information about Harry specifically," Sirius said. James suspected it was a teacher, but he died before he could prove it. Harry felt his stomach drop as understanding hit him. "Professor Quirrell." "Quirrell?" Dumbledore's voice held surprise and growing alarm. "He's been acting strangely all term," Harry said, remembering the nervous, stuttering teacher from his brief time at Hogwarts. And he always seemed wrong somehow, like he was afraid of something. "Or someone," Daphne said quietly. "Someone who might be sharing his body." The silence that followed was profound. Harry could see the implications of this revelation spreading through the assembled group like ripples in a pond. If Voldemort was already back at Hogwarts, possessing a teacher, then every student there was in danger. "We have to warn someone," Harry said. "We have to do more than that," Sirius replied grimly. "We have to finish what James started. We have to hunt down those Horcruxes and destroy them before Voldemort finds a way to return to full power." Harry looked around the Goblin Hall at the people who'd become his family. Daphne, who'd sacrificed everything for the right to choose her own path. Sirius, who'd endured 12 years of hell for crimes he didn't commit. The goblins who'd offered them sanctuary when the wizarding world wanted to use them. They were planning to hunt down pieces of the Dark Lord's soul. At 11 years old, it should have been terrifying. Instead, Harry found himself thinking of his father's research, of the training he'd received from centaurs and werewolves and goblins, of the strength he'd found in choosing his own path. "Then that's what we do," he said. "We finish what my father started." Chapter 10. The Shadow Returns. The Potter family vault had yielded more secrets than Harry had ever imagined possible. 3 days of intensive study had revealed research that painted a picture of dark magic, so comprehensive and disturbing that even Sirius, who'd grown up in the House of Black, looked shaken. 7, Harry said quietly, staring at the diagram his father had sketched in meticulous detail. He made 7 Horcruxes. Daphne sat cross-legged on the vault floor, surrounded by books that had been in the Greengrass family collection for generations, texts on dark arts that her parents had never imagined she'd actually read. Her grey eyes were bright with the kind of intellectual excitement that came from solving a puzzle that had stumped everyone else. "Not 7, she corrected, consulting one of the ancient volumes. 6 Horcruxes, plus his original soul. 7 pieces total, the most powerful number in magical theory." "Most unstable too," Sirius added grimly. According to this research, splitting the soul that many times would have left him barely human even before his body was destroyed. Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground cold of Gringotts. The idea that something so fundamentally wrong was not only alive but actively working to return to power made his skin crawl. "So what do we do?" he asked. "We do what your father intended," Sirius replied, his voice carrying the weight of old grief and new determination. "We hunt them down and destroy them." "But first," Daphne said, closing the book she'd been reading with a decisive snap, "we need to deal with the immediate threat." She was right, and Harry knew it. According to James Potter's research, Voldemort had been seeking the Philosopher's Stone as a means of returning to physical form without requiring his Horcruxes. If he succeeded, he'd be back to full power with his soul anchors still intact, essentially unkillable. "Dumbledore won't listen to us," Harry said, voicing what they all knew. "Not after everything that's happened." "He'll listen," Sirius said with grim certainty. "When we present him with proof he can't ignore." "What kind of proof?" Daphne asked. "The kind that requires us to return to Hogwarts," Harry said, understanding where his godfather's logic was leading. "We need to catch Quirrell in the act." The plan they developed was insane by any reasonable standard. Infiltrate Hogwarts during the Christmas holidays when security was minimal, locate Quirrell and gather evidence of his possession, confront Voldemort directly if necessary, escape with proof that even Dumbledore couldn't dismiss. Harry had trained for months under some of the most unconventional magical teachers in Britain. Daphne had mastered defensive magic and protective charms that most 7th-year students couldn't manage. They were well prepared by the standards of 11-year-old wizards. They were also completely out of their depth when it came to facing the Dark Lord. "The wards around Hogwarts won't keep us out," Daphne said, as they finalized their preparations. "Pure-blood families have emergency access protocols for family emergencies. I can get us past the perimeter." "And once we're inside?" Sirius asked. "We use everything we've learned," Harry said simply, "and we hope it's enough." Christmas Eve found them crouched behind a snow-covered hedge on the grounds of Hogwarts, watching the castle they'd walked away from 4 months ago. The windows glowed with warm light, but there was something wrong about the atmosphere, a sense of tension that hadn't been there during Harry's brief time as a student. "There," Daphne whispered, pointing toward the 3rd floor. "That window's been dark every time we've looked, but now there's movement." Harry followed her gaze and saw a flickering light moving through what he remembered as the Forbidden Corridor. Someone was up there, alone, during the Christmas holidays when most of the school was empty. Getting inside proved easier than Harry had expected. Daphne's knowledge of pure blood emergency protocols was frighteningly comprehensive, and the castle's wards recognized her bloodline, even though her family had disowned her. They slipped through passages that Harry hadn't known existed, following routes that Daphne had memorized from family maps that were older than Hogwarts itself. Greengrass family emergency access, she explained quietly, as they climbed a staircase that definitely hadn't been on the Marauders' map. Pure-blood families insisted on back doors when the castle was built, in case their children needed extraction during political upheavals. Paranoid, Harry observed. Practical, Daphne corrected, as we're proving right now. They found Quirrell in the third-floor corridor, standing before a massive mirror that seemed to show something other than reflections. The professor was muttering to himself in a voice that carried none of his usual nervous stutter, and Harry felt his blood turn to ice as he recognized the tone. Cold, certain, utterly without mercy. "You see it, don't you?" Quirrell was saying, though there was no one visible for him to address. "The stone, within your reach. All you need do is tell me how to retrieve it." "Who is he talking to?" Daphne breathed. Harry was about to say he didn't know when Quirrell turned slightly, revealing the back of his head, and the face that was somehow pressed against his skull, as though trying to push through from the inside. "My faithful servant," the face said, and Harry's scar erupted in pain so sudden and intense that he had to bite down on his tongue to keep from crying out. "Show me what the mirror reveals." Voldemort, not just possessing Quirrell, but visible, speaking, directing his servant's actions. Harry felt terror wash over him in waves, but underneath it was something else, a cold fury that reminded him of his father's research, of years of preparation for this exact moment. "The boy," Voldemort said suddenly, his red eyes turning toward their hiding place. "I can feel him. Harry Potter is here." Quirrell spun around, his borrowed face twisting with malicious joy. "Harry Potter, the famous Harry Potter, come to play the hero?" Harry stepped out from behind the statue they'd been using for cover, his wand steady in his hand, despite the terror racing through his veins. Beside him, Daphne moved with the fluid grace that months of defensive training had given her. "Professor Quirrell," Harry said, proud that his voice came out steady. "Or should I say, Lord Voldemort?" "Such a clever boy," Voldemort hissed, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Did you think to stop me? Did you think your childish magic could stand against the greatest wizard who ever lived?" "I think," Daphne said, her voice crisp with aristocratic authority, "that the greatest wizard who ever lived wouldn't need to hide behind a stuttering professor and steal magical artifacts." Voldemort's laugh was like breaking glass. "Ah, the little pure-blood traitor. Tell me, child, do you truly believe that your blood makes you special? That your heritage grants you power?" "I believe," Daphne replied, raising her wand, "that power comes from choice, not blood, and I choose to stand against you." The battle that followed was unlike anything Harry had ever experienced. Quirrell moved with inhuman speed and strength, his magic amplified by the presence of the Dark Lord. But Harry and Daphne had trained together for months, learning to fight as a unit, to anticipate each other's movements and complement each other's strengths. Harry focused on protection, shields, barriers, deflections that kept Voldemort's curses from finding their mark. Daphne wove binding spells and diversions, magic that used their opponent's aggression against him. Together, they managed to hold their own against power that should have overwhelmed them completely. But it wasn't enough. "Enough games," Voldemort snarled, and suddenly Quirrell's hands were around Harry's throat, lifting him off the ground with strength that belonged to something other than human muscle. "You will watch, little pure blood, as I drain the life from your friend, and then you will serve me, or join him in death." Harry felt his vision beginning to darken, felt his magical strength failing as Quirrell's grip tightened. Through the haze of approaching unconsciousness, he heard Daphne crying out, saw her wand moving in patterns he didn't recognize. "Ancient magic," she was chanting, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Blood and bond and choice freely given. I bind myself to Harry Potter's fate, his magic to mine, his strength to my protection." The magic that exploded from her wand was like nothing Harry had ever seen. Silver light that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, power that drew on sources older than the castle around them. It struck Quirrell like a physical blow, sending him flying backward, his hands torn away from Harry's throat. But more than that, Harry felt something fundamental change inside him. Where before there had been only his own magical core, now there was something else, a connection, warm and strong and utterly certain, linking him to Daphne in ways he couldn't begin to understand. "What have you done?" Voldemort screamed, his voice distorted by pain and fury. "Pure blood family magic," Daphne gasped, her face pale from magical exhaustion, but her eyes blazing with triumph. "A binding that protects both participants. He can't touch Harry while the bond exists, and it exists as long as we both live." Harry felt the truth of her words resonate through the connection between them. Whatever she'd done, it had created a magical bond that Voldemort's touch magic couldn't overcome. "You think this will save you?" Voldemort hissed. "You think your little binding will protect you from what is coming?" "I think," Harry said, finding his voice and his strength returning through the bond, "that we have what we came for." He was right. The confrontation had provided exactly the proof they needed. Visible evidence of Voldemort's return, confirmation of his presence at Hogwarts, and demonstration of the immediate threat he represented. But as they prepared to escape, Quirrell made one final desperate lunge for the mirror, his hands closing around something that gleamed red as blood. "The stone," Voldemort breathed. At last, the stone. Harry watched in horror as Quirrell raised the Philosopher's Stone, the legendary artifact that could grant immortality to whoever possessed it. In Voldemort's hands, it would mean the return of the Dark Lord at full power. But as Quirrell's fingers closed around the stone, something went wrong. Instead of the triumphant transformation Voldemort expected, the artifact began to smoke and crackle, its surface turning black as though it were being consumed by some internal fire. "What?" Voldemort began, but his words were cut off as the stone crumbled to ash in Quirrell's hands. "Blood magic," Daphne said with sudden understanding. "The protection on the stone. It can only be obtained by someone who wants to find it, but not use it. Voldemort's desire for immortality poisoned his touch." Quirrell screamed, a sound of such rage and frustration that it seemed to shake the very stones of the castle. But without the stone, Voldemort's hold on his servant was failing. Harry could see the Dark Lord's face growing fainter, his presence weakening. "This is not over, Harry Potter," Voldemort hissed as his form began to dissipate. "I will return, and when I do, your little bond will not save you." "Maybe not," Harry said, feeling strength and certainty flowing through his connection with Daphne. "But it'll be enough to stop you this time?" Voldemort's scream of rage followed them as they fled the castle, using the same hidden passages that had brought them inside. By the time they reached the grounds, Harry could no longer feel the Dark Lord's presence in the castle. They'd done it. They'd confronted Voldemort, and lived. More importantly, they'd prevented his immediate return to power. But as they made their way back toward London, Harry could feel the magical bond between him and Daphne humming with possibility and danger in equal measure. Whatever she'd done to save his life, it had changed both of them in ways they were only beginning to understand. "Are you all right?" he asked, as they paused at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Daphne looked at him, her grey eyes bright with something that might have been wonder. "I can feel your magic," she said quietly, "and you can feel mine, can't you?" Harry nodded. The connection between them was warm and strong, and utterly unprecedented in his experience. "What exactly did you do?" "Something my grandmother taught me," Daphne replied. "Pure blood family magic that's supposed to protect against dark arts. I've never heard of it being used between people who aren't actually family, but we are family now," Harry finished, understanding flooding through him. "Aren't we? In every way that matters." Daphne's smile was like sunrise. "Yes, I think we are." As they walked away from Hogwarts together, Harry felt the weight of what they'd accomplished settling around him. They'd faced the Dark Lord and survived. They'd prevented his immediate return to power. They'd forged a magical bond that would protect them both. But most importantly, they'd proven that the path they'd chosen, the path away from expectations and toward their own choices, was strong enough to stand against even the greatest darkness. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Chapter 11. The Trial of Choice. The Wizengamot Chambers had not seen a case quite like this in over 2 centuries. Harry could feel the weight of history pressing down on him as he stood in the center of the ancient amphitheater, surrounded by 50 of the most powerful witches and wizards in Britain. The magical bond he now shared with Daphne hummed with nervous energy, her presence beside him the only thing keeping his courage steady. "Harry James Potter and Daphne Lyra Greengrass," Chief Warlock Cornelius Fudge intoned from his position at the head of the court, "you stand accused of willful abandonment of magical education, endangering yourselves and others through reckless behavior, and undermining the authority of established wizarding institutions." Harry felt Daphne's hand brush his, barely a touch, but enough to send reassurance through their bond. 4 months of alternative education had prepared them for this moment, though nothing could have fully prepared him for the reality of standing trial before the highest court in magical Britain. "How do you plead?" Fudge continued. "We plead," Daphne said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber with the authority she'd learned from months of studying magical law, "that the charges as stated represent a fundamental misunderstanding of both magical law and educational choice." A ripple of surprise went through the assembled Wizengamot members. Harry caught several of them exchanging glances that spoke of genuine confusion. They'd clearly expected frightened children, not young people capable of mounting a legal defense. "Miss Greengrass," said Madam Bones from her position among the court members, "are you representing yourself and Mr. Potter in these proceedings?" "We are representing ourselves," Daphne confirmed. "As is our right under magical law, specifically the Educational Choice Statutes of 1692 and the minority rights provisions established by the International Confederation of Wizards in 1845. Harry watched the court scribes frantically writing notes, clearly struggling to keep up with legal references that many of the Wizengamot members probably didn't know existed. Daphne's months of intensive study with Ragnok and her research into ancient texts were paying off in ways that even she probably hadn't expected. "The Educational Choice Statutes," Fudge said with obvious irritation, "have never been interpreted to allow children to simply abandon their schooling." "With respect, Chief Warlock," Daphne replied, "the statutes have never been tested, because no child before Harry Potter has had the resources or support network to pursue genuinely alternative magical education. We're not abandoning education. We're seeking it from sources that the traditional system has systematically excluded." "Sources such as?" asked a stern-faced wizard Harry didn't recognize. "Goblin legal theory," Harry said, finding his voice and drawing strength from the bond. "Centaur divination and nature magic. Werewolf defensive techniques, squib resistance networks, house elf domestic magic. We've learned from teachers who have been practicing magic longer than Hogwarts has existed." The silence that followed his words was profound. Harry could see several Wizengamot members looking genuinely shocked, not at the idea that such education might exist, but at the implication that it might be valuable. "Preposterous," spluttered a witch with elaborate purple robes. "Magical beings are not qualified to educate human children." are they not? Griphook's voice came from the witness area, where the goblin sat with the dignity of someone representing an ancient nation. Goblin magical theory predates human wizarding by millennia. Our understanding of magical law and finance has shaped wizarding society since its inception. If goblins are not qualified to educate, then perhaps wizards are not qualified to be educated. The chamber erupted in angry voices and indignant protests, but Chief Warlock Fudge's gavel restored order with sharp cracks that echoed off the stone walls. "The court will hear from witness Griphook of the Goblin Nation," Fudge announced, with obvious reluctance. Griphook stood with the kind of formal dignity that reminded everyone present that goblins had been managing wizarding finances since before the ministry existed. "Honored Wizengamot," Griphook began, "I have had the privilege of instructing Mr. Potter and Miss Greengrass in magical law, financial theory, and international relations for the past 4 months. Their grasp of complex legal concepts exceeds that of many qualified wizards. Their understanding of magical economics is sophisticated enough to manage substantial financial holdings. They have demonstrated intellectual capacity that makes a mockery of the suggestion that they are abandoning education." "But surely," interrupted Madame Bones, "traditional magical education provides a foundation that—" "Traditional magical education," Griphook said with sharp emphasis, "provides indoctrination into a system that has systematically excluded non-human perspectives, ignored alternative magical theories, and perpetuated prejudices that weaken the entire magical community." Harry felt his chest tighten with pride and gratitude. Griphook wasn't just defending their choice, he was challenging the entire foundation of wizarding education. "Moreover," Griphook continued, producing a thick folder of documents, "Goblin investigations have uncovered evidence of systematic corruption within the very institutions these children are accused of abandoning." Fudge's face went pale. "Corruption is a serious accusation." "Corruption is a documented fact," Griphook interrupted, opening the folder to reveal financial records, correspondence, and photographs that made several Wizengamot members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Evidence of ministry officials accepting payments from known Death Eaters, records of Hogwarts board members manipulating school policies for personal gain, documentation of systematic discrimination against magical creatures and non-human magical beings. The chamber fell silent as Griphook methodically presented evidence that painted a picture of institutional failure so comprehensive that Harry felt sick just listening to it. "This evidence," Griphook concluded, "suggests that Mr. Potter and Miss Greengrass were not abandoning education. They were escaping corruption." Before Fudge could respond, the doors to the Wizengamot chambers opened with a sound like thunder. A group of young people in Hogwarts robes entered with the kind of determined purpose that spoke of courage, carefully gathered and firmly held. "Neville," Harry said, recognizing the boy who'd once looked terrified during his own sorting. Neville Longbottom stood at the head of a group that included Luna Lovegood, Hannah Abbott, Susan Bones, and at least 20 other students Harry recognized from his brief time at Hogwarts. "Students are not permitted in Wizengamot proceedings," Fudge said sharply. "Actually," said Susan Bones, stepping forward with the confidence that came from being related to a sitting member of the court, "citizens have the right to present testimony in cases that affect educational policy. And this case affects all of us." Neville moved to the center of the chamber with none of the nervous uncertainty Harry remembered. 4 months of leading the educational choice movement at Hogwarts had clearly changed him. "Honored Wizengamot," Neville said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "we represent over 200 Hogwarts students who support Harry Potter and Daphne Greengrass's right to choose their own education." 200? Madame Bones asked, her eyebrows raised. "Nearly 40% of the student body," Luna Lovegood added in her dreamy voice. "We've been meeting in secret since September, discussing whether the current system really serves our needs. Harry and Daphne showed us that there are alternatives." What you've shown them, Fudge said angrily, is that children can be encouraged to rebel against proper authority. What we've shown them, Harry replied, feeling strength flow through his bond with Daphne, is that education should be about learning, not about fitting into predetermined categories. Mr. Potter, said a Wizengamot member Harry didn't recognize, surely you must admit that your alternative education cannot match the comprehensive curriculum provided by Hogwarts. Harry exchanged a glance with Daphne, seeing his own determination reflected in her grey eyes. Actually, Daphne said, we'd be happy to demonstrate. What followed was unlike anything the Wizengamot had ever witnessed. Harry called to the owl that nested in the chamber's rafters, speaking to it in the ancient language of magical creatures that Firenze had taught him. The bird responded immediately, alighting on his shoulder and engaging in what was clearly genuine conversation. Daphne, meanwhile, drew her wand and began casting spells that made several Wizengamot members lean forward in their seats. Her shield work was so advanced that the magical barriers she created seemed to sing with their own inner music. Her transfiguration turned a simple quill into a complex mechanical device that moved with the precision of goblin engineering. Remarkable, breathed Madame Bones. Miss Greengrass, that transfiguration work is Newt level or higher. It's based on goblin manufacturing techniques, Daphne replied calmly, combined with centaur understanding of mechanical harmony and house elf domestic magic efficiency principles. The chamber had gone completely silent. Harry could see Wizengamot members exchanging glances that spoke of genuine amazement mixed with growing concern about what they'd been assuming about alternative education. Furthermore, Daphne continued, our education has provided us with knowledge that may be critical to the safety of the wizarding world. She produced the memories they'd extracted from their confrontation with Quirrell, evidence of Voldemort's survival, documentation of his possession of a Hogwarts teacher, proof that the Dark Lord was actively working to return to power. Impossible, Fudge said, his voice tight with what looked like panic. The Dark Lord is dead. This is clearly fabricated evidence designed to what? Sirius Black's voice came from the witness area, where Harry's godfather sat with the kind of grim authority that came from having faced these exact threats before. To warn you that the man who murdered the Potters is still alive? To suggest that maybe, just maybe, you should take the threat seriously? Sirius stood, and Harry could see the weight of 12 years in Azkaban in his bearing, but also the strength that had carried him through hell to protect the people he loved. Honored Wizengamot, Sirius said formally, I stand before you as the wrongfully imprisoned godfather of Harry Potter, as the heir to the ancient and most noble House of Black, and as someone who has spent the last 4 months watching these children demonstrate magical abilities and intellectual sophistication that would impress adult wizards. He gestured toward Harry and Daphne. They have created a magical bond that protects them from dark arts. They have mastered defensive techniques taught by werewolves, learned legal theory from goblins, and studied divination with centaurs. They have faced the Dark Lord himself and lived to bring you warning. The silence that followed Sirius's words was absolute. The question before this court, Sirius continued, is not whether these children have abandoned proper education. The question is whether the wizarding world is wise enough to learn from what they've accomplished. Chief Warlock Fudge looked around the chamber, clearly searching for support that was rapidly evaporating. Harry could see the Wizengamot members whispering among themselves, could feel the political winds shifting as the evidence mounted. This court will recess, Fudge announced finally, to consider the evidence presented. As the Wizengamot members filed out for deliberation, Harry felt Daphne's hand slip into his, their magical bond humming with shared anticipation and anxiety. Whatever they decide, she said quietly. We did this right. Harry squeezed her hand, looking around at the people who had supported them. Griphook, representing goblin interests. Serious, carrying the weight of family loyalty. The Hogwarts students who had risked academic consequences to stand with them. "Yeah," he said, feeling certainty settle in his chest. "We did this exactly right." When the Wizengamot reconvened an hour later, the atmosphere in the chamber had changed completely. Fudge looked haggard, and several members who had seemed hostile earlier now appeared thoughtful rather than angry. "The Wizengamot," Madam Bones announced, having apparently replaced Fudge as the voice of the court, "has reached a decision." Harry felt his heart stop. "Harry Potter and Daphne Greengrass," Madam Bones continued, "are found not guilty of abandoning magical education. Furthermore, this court officially recognizes their right to pursue alternative educational arrangements and establishes legal precedent for educational choice within the wizarding community." The chamber erupted in cheers from the student delegation, but Madam Bones wasn't finished. "Additionally," she said, raising her voice over the celebrations, "this court finds merit in the evidence of institutional corruption presented today. A formal investigation will be launched into the activities described in the Goblin intelligence reports." Harry felt Daphne's joy through their bond, but there was something else there too, a sense of completion, of a long journey finally reaching its destination. "Finally," Madam Bones said, "this court formally recognizes the magical bond between Harry Potter and Daphne Greengrass as legitimate family magic, with all the legal protections and responsibilities such bonds entail." As the gavel fell for the final time, Harry realized that they had done something unprecedented. They hadn't just won their case, they had changed magical law itself. The wizarding world would never be quite the same. Chapter 12. The New Path Forward. 1 year later, on a crisp September morning that reminded Harry Potter of the day he'd first refused the Sorting Hat, he stood before the gates of a school that shouldn't have existed. The sign beside the entrance read, "The Alliance Academy for Educational Freedom," in letters that shimmered with the combined magic of goblins, centaurs, and human wizards working together. "Ready?" Daphne asked, her hand slipping into his with the natural ease that had developed over 12 months of shared triumphs and challenges. The magical bond between them had settled into something warm and constant. Not the desperate protection magic she'd cast to save his life, but something deeper and more permanent that felt like coming home. Harry squeezed her fingers, looking past the gates to the grounds where students of all ages moved between buildings that reflected the diverse, magical traditions that had helped create this place. A group of third years practiced defensive magic under the watchful eye of Marcus Belby, while nearby a centaur foal played with human children who'd grown up believing that magical beings were equals rather than servants. "More than ready," he said, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest. The year since their Wizengamot victory had passed in a blur of construction, legislation, and the kind of careful political maneuvering that Daphne had proven surprisingly adept at managing. The legal precedent they'd established had opened floodgates that even Harry hadn't anticipated. Within 6 months, over 300 families had filed for alternative education arrangements, and the ministry had been forced to create an entire new department to manage educational choice applications. "Mr. Potter, Miss Greengrass," came Firenze's familiar voice as the centaur approached from the main building. "The morning assembly is prepared to begin." Harry still felt a thrill of pride when he looked at their school. The buildings themselves were a testament to collaborative magic, goblin stonework that would last for millennia, centaur architecture that worked with the natural curves of the land, human magical engineering that provided all the practical necessities of education, and house-elf domestic magic that made every space feel warm and welcoming. "How many new students this term?" Daphne asked, as they walked through corridors filled with the sound of learning taking place in a dozen different ways. 47 first years, Firenze replied with something that might have been pride, including 12 whose families have withdrawn them from Hogwarts specifically to attend here. The number no longer surprised Harry. Over the past year, their Alliance Academy had become something approaching legendary in certain circles, the school where magical beings taught alongside human wizards, where students learned creature communication as readily as transfiguration, where ancient magical theory was valued as highly as modern spell work. It had also become a political statement that made certain people very uncomfortable. "Any word from the Ministry about the new regulations?" Harry asked. "Passed the Wizengamot 3 days ago," Daphne replied with satisfaction. "Full legal recognition for interspecies educational programs, mandatory inclusion of non-human magical perspectives in curriculum development, and protected status for alternative schools." Harry felt a surge of amazement that was becoming familiar. Sometimes he still couldn't quite believe that 2 12-year-olds had managed to change wizarding law so fundamentally that the entire educational system was being restructured around principles they'd fought for. They reached the Great Hall, their own version, smaller than Hogwarts's, but somehow more welcoming, with long tables that mixed students of different ages, backgrounds, and even species. Harry could see Luna Lovegood sitting next to a young goblin who was apparently explaining the finer points of financial magic, while Neville Longbottom practiced herbology techniques with a centaur who understood plants in ways that human wizards were only beginning to appreciate. "Students and teachers," Daphne's voice carried clearly through the hall as she stood to address the assembled school. "Welcome to the start of our 2nd academic year." Harry watched her with the kind of wonder that had been growing steadily over the months. The girl who'd followed him out of Hogwarts on pure impulse had become someone who could command the attention of a room full of magical beings and human students with equal ease. She'd retained all her aristocratic poise, but had transformed it into something that served others rather than elevating herself. "This year," Daphne continued, "we welcome new students from 7 different countries, 3 human magical traditions, and 5 non-human magical communities. We also welcome our first exchange students from Beauxbatons Academy, who will be studying our interspecies collaboration methods." The applause that followed was enthusiastic, but not overwhelming. One of the things Harry loved about their school was that achievement was celebrated, but not worshipped. "Before we begin the term properly," Daphne added, "I'd like to introduce someone who has travelled a very long way to speak with us." A figure emerged from behind the teacher's table, someone Harry hadn't seen in months, but who had become instrumental in their school's development. Astoria Greengrass looked remarkably like her sister, but where Daphne had developed an air of serene authority, Astoria carried herself with the quick intelligence that marked her as a natural researcher. "Astoria!" Daphne's composure cracked slightly as she hurried to embrace her younger sister. The reconciliation between the Greengrass sisters had been one of the year's more private victories. Astoria had spent months quietly documenting educational outcomes at Hogwarts versus alternative institutions, building an academic case for reform that had proven invaluable in political negotiations. "I brought news," Astoria said, her voice carrying to the assembled students. "The International Confederation of Wizards has voted to adopt the Alliance Academy model as a recommended standard for magical education. Schools based on our principles are being established in France, Germany, and the Nordic countries." The hall erupted in genuine excitement. Harry felt his chest swell with pride, and something that might have been awe. What had started as 2 11-year-olds walking away from expectations had become an international movement. "Furthermore," Astoria continued, producing an official-looking document, "I'm pleased to announce that our parents have formally acknowledged the legitimacy of Daphne's choices and requested reconciliation." The silence that followed was profound. Harry knew how much Daphne had sacrificed when she'd renounced her family, not just wealth and social position, but the deep connections that came from centuries of shared history. "They want to meet with you," Astoria said quietly. "To apologize. And to ask if there's a place for reformed, pure-blood families in the world you're building." Daphne looked at Harry, and he could feel her uncertainty through their bond, not about forgiveness, which came easily to her, but about whether she could trust that the changes were genuine. "There's a place for everyone who believes in choice over tradition," Harry said, speaking not just to Daphne, but to the assembled school. "For everyone who thinks magic should bring people together, rather than keeping them apart." The applause this time was thunderous, but Harry was focused on Daphne's expression, the way relief and hope were warring with 12 years of learned caution. After the assembly, they walked through grounds that had become as familiar as breathing. Students moved between classes that would have seemed impossible at traditional schools. Goblin economics taught alongside human transfiguration, centaur astronomy combined with house elf domestic magic theory, werewolf defensive techniques integrated with traditional dueling instruction. "Do you ever regret it?" Harry asked, as they paused beside the memorial garden they'd established for all those who'd suffered under the old systems, his parents, but also house elves who'd died in service, goblins killed in rebellions, werewolves destroyed by prejudice. "Walking away from Hogwarts?" Daphne considered the question seriously. "Never. But I do wonder sometimes what would have happened if we'd tried to change things from the inside." "We'd have been sorted into houses," Harry replied, "separated by arbitrary categories, taught to compete rather than collaborate. We'd have learned human magic from human teachers and never discovered that there were other ways to understand power." "And we never would have found each other," Daphne added softly. The magical bond between them had evolved over the months, from desperate protection to something that felt as natural as breathing. Firenze had explained it to them during one of his lessons on ancient magic, a connection that occurred when two people chose to bind their magical signatures not out of romantic love, but out of perfect trust and shared purpose. Family magic, the centaur had called it, rarer than soul bonds, more permanent than marriage contracts. You have become family in the truest magical sense. "Harry," Daphne said, her voice carrying a note of wonder that had become familiar over the year of building their school together. "Look." She was pointing toward the main entrance, where a familiar figure in midnight blue robes was approaching with the measured pace of someone who had been putting off a difficult conversation for too long. "Dumbledore," Harry said, feeling his stomach tighten with old anger and newer understanding. The headmaster of Hogwarts looked older than Harry remembered, his blue eyes dimmed by something that might have been regret. He walked through their school grounds with the careful respect of someone who understood he was a guest in a place that represented everything he had failed to achieve. "Harry, Daphne," Dumbledore said as he reached them, his voice carrying none of the grandfatherly authority that Harry remembered. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "Professor," Daphne replied with the careful courtesy that marked her as someone who had learned to separate personal feelings from political necessity. "I have come," Dumbledore said quietly, "to apologize. And to ask for your help." Harry felt surprise ripple through his bond with Daphne. Of all the things they might have expected, this wasn't one of them. "Apologize for what?" Harry asked. "For believing that I knew what was best for you, without asking what you wanted for yourselves," Dumbledore replied. "For allowing fear of the future to blind me to the possibilities of the present. For treating you as symbols, rather than as children with the right to choose their own paths." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Harry could feel in his bones. "The wizarding world has changed," Dumbledore continued. "Your Alliance Academy has proven that magical education can be broader, more inclusive, more effective than anything we achieved at Hogwarts." Students are arriving at my school asking why they can't learn goblin magic, why centaurs aren't on our teaching staff, why house elves are servants rather than colleagues. And? Daphne asked. And I find myself unable to answer them, Dumbledore admitted, because the questions they're asking are the same ones you asked a year ago, and I was too set in my ways to hear them. Harry looked at Daphne, feeling her uncertainty through their bond. This was the man who had kept secrets from him, who had manipulated his life from a distance, who had represented everything they'd chosen to reject. But it was also the man who had ultimately let them make their choice, who had not used his considerable power to force them back to Hogwarts. "What kind of help do you need?" Harry asked finally. "Hogwarts is losing students every term," Dumbledore said bluntly. "Not just to your school, but to a dozen others that have been established using your model. Parents are demanding change, but the Board of Governors and many of the teaching staff resist any modification to traditional methods. So you want us to help you modernize Hogwarts?" Daphne's voice held something between amusement and incredulity. "I want you to help me prove that change is possible," Dumbledore corrected. "That cooperation between your Alliance Academy and Hogwarts could benefit both institutions and all the students we serve." Harry felt his world shifting around the possibility that his old headmaster was suggesting. A partnership between the school that had rejected him and the school he'd helped create. A chance to bring the changes they'd fought for to the institution that most needed them. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "A lot of people at Hogwarts won't want to work with a school founded by children who walked away. And a lot of people here won't want to work with an institution that represents everything we've been fighting against," Daphne added. "Perhaps," Dumbledore said with something that might have been a smile. "But I have learned this year that young people are often wiser than their elders when it comes to questions of cooperation and inclusion." Harry looked around at the school they'd built, at students learning from teachers who represented the full spectrum of magical knowledge, at buildings that reflected architectural traditions from across the magical world, at a community that had grown from two children's refusal to accept limitation. "We'll consider it," he said finally. "But any partnership would have to be between equals. No more treating alternative education as inferior to traditional methods. No more assuming that human magic is the only magic worth teaching," Daphne added. "And no more making decisions about students' lives without consulting the students themselves," Harry finished. Dumbledore nodded slowly, his blue eyes bright with something that looked like genuine hope. "Those terms seem more than reasonable," he said. "Thank you for considering the possibility." As the old headmaster walked away, Harry felt Daphne's hand slip into his, their magical bond humming with shared amazement at how far they'd travelled from two frightened children walking out of the great hall. "Do you think it could work?" she asked. "I think," Harry replied, looking at the school they'd built and the community they'd fostered, "that anything is possible if enough people choose to make it happen." Above them, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across grounds where magic was being redefined by young people who had learned that the most powerful spell of all was the courage to choose your own path. Whatever the future held, whether it included partnership with Hogwarts or continued independence, whether it faced the remaining threat of Voldemort or the challenges of peaceful reform, they would meet it together. After all, they had already proven that sometimes the most important magic happened when you walked away from what everyone expected and chose to build something entirely new. And that, Harry thought, as he felt the warmth of home settling around him, was the best kind of magic there was.